this work here. And yeah, I mean, might be interesting for discussion if you have a chance to watch it. Have people seen it? I mean, you know, this is at the same period as Hawks and Sparrows of Pasolini before he did Oedipus Rex, and of course many ones in between. He divided his work into the epic field, which was the Gospel according to Saint Matthew, and Oedipus Rex were both part of his what he called his epic period. But this was earlier. Yeah, Bruno, you wanted to say something? I see you leaning forward. Yeah, I'm learning how to read gestures on Zoom. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I mean, then the trilogy of life, I think it's
Yeah,
called.
the trilogy.
The one, the Cameron, the Contemporary Tales, and yeah. This one, maybe I should watch it again. I had to say that I had never been particularly taken by this movie Teorema. I watched it a couple of times, I guess, but I'll watch it a long time ago. I'll watch it again.
Yeah, let me know what you think.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was sort of taken by it, rereading the Oedipus and thinking of Pasolini's moment. And you know, Deleuze and Guattari mentioned Pierre Kloskowski, his book Sade and Fournier, you know, his attempt to look at the French Revolution and utopian socialism by Kloskowski. So I was thinking of the great work of Kloskowski, Sade, My Neighbor, another great film of which is another book of which Pasolini uses in his last work, Salo.
Yeah, and I might say that maybe Salo is for me the most perhaps interesting. Some other things by Pasolini, but otherwise I don't. But Salo, yes, Salo is very important, I believe. He hadn't finished.
Yeah, I recommend Salo. It's you know, I'm told by my friend Aronowitz that when he saw it in Paris when it first came out, 80% of the people walked out after 15 minutes, 20 minutes. But he stayed and watched it. I didn't walk out. I mean, you know, okay.
Yeah, me neither.
Yeah, pretty amazing film. And actually, Kloskowski, Bataille, Simone de Beauvoir, and others are all cited as texts at the end of the film that he read and thought about, right? And yeah, very interesting in that regard. So yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to bring that up, and yeah, maybe, I mean, just to start today, I know people have various political positions or political placements in the world here. Josefa, you mind telling us what's happening in Bolivia, just in a very general way, since you are, you know, you did the Bolivian cinema last week, and just a little bit of what's happening. Are they going to be able to take this previous coup to jail or put them on trial in a good way, like the Greeks did with the junta in 1973-4? Yeah.
Well, this was a conference on film, so but there's a lot of talk about basically what the role of the, you know, of the Organization of American States was in this coup.
Right.
Right. And sorry, let me turn this off. So all I know is that the ex-president is running, and I think she was caught, as far as I know. And then I had a friend who was basically she's an indigenous woman. It's Maria Eugenia Choque, and she was the leader of the elections. I visited her when I was down there last February. She was in jail, and she's been under house arrest now, but no one wants to direct her PhD dissertation, which is she wants to write on the election.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Is she still in jail with the new government?
She's under house arrest.
Oh, okay. And any reason for that? Why the new government wouldn't, you know, release her? Yeah.
That's what I heard about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I don't know if that changed.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just kind of interested. Okay, very interesting. All right. Yeah. Good. Okay. All right. Well, we have a lot on the table. First of all, I want to thank the great participant. Lydia is not here yet, but David did a great job. We were going over the 3 texts of Freud. I want to return to that just to ground us, and then we'll go further into this section. And I also want to backtrack a little bit. And what I'm thinking about tonight, we'll have a discussion about, again, holy familialism and, their attempt to kind of break the Oedipal, familialization, the holy familialism of psychoanalysis, and kind of free it in some ways, they think, from a very oppressive, rock of castration, if you will, and lack of the ability to really liberate. And, there's something to be said, I think, for their argument. And so we can go over that. And then the following week, we will, next Wednesday, I'll try to give, as best as I can, a kind of logical synthesis, if you will, if it's possible, of where we are to today, up to going into the second part of the third part, actually, of the book, which is really the encounter with Freud and Marx. Marx is more prevalent in chapter 3, Savages and Barbarization and Civilizing Machines. So we're going to be going into the relationships of desiring production and Marx, and alongside Freud. So this would be the next move in the text. And then we would then, for the latter part of the term, and I'm figuring 10 weeks isn't going to be enough, unfortunately or fortunately. We'll probably have to go an extra couple of sessions into May, and take on the schizoid analysis. We have a phrase in New Orleans that Josepha knows called lagniappe. You get one extra, donut or one extra oyster, instead of a dozen, you get 13. Lagniappe is what they say. So I try to do that in the classes, you get 10, but we really do 11 and, whatever. So, so that's called lagniappe in New Orleans culture. Yeah, it's got the giving of one extra, 7% in oysters, 7.5% extra. So anyway, I would like to go back just to recapitulate just a little bit about what the project here is about for them. It's a very, very, engaging project, to put it mildly, a very ambitious project. Again, the idea is to find a materialist psychiatry. And this is basically on page 35, where the project is really announced, right? And this is very, very important to keep remembering, to found a materialist psychiatry. This is where they want to go. There are many, many conflicts within, French psychoanalysis. For those of you that know Lacan, 1969, we talked about this a little bit earlier, the other side of psychoanalysis, which is now translated into English and has been for a few years, were the seminar that he gave after May of '68. And this created all kinds of problems, and in a way, the Lacanian machinery, if you will, if you want to look at it that way, went in many directions. One was towards the matheme, the mathematical, and you had a group of people that really took Lacan's proposition that the unconscious could be mathematically formalized. This proposition was taken up seriously. So, there were a lot of attempts by analytical and phenomenological philosophers to try to engage this kind of set of propositions and look at the algebraic X, if you will, of the unconscious. And this was one direction. There are other directions taken, of course, by the feminists. And this was in Britain, by Juliet Mitchell and Jacqueline Rose, who I have great admiration for. She's still alive and teaching, etc. Jacqueline Rose, Sexuality in the Field of Vision, which is a remarkable study of the gaze, the Lacanian gaze. And she's one of the very best out there. Certainly worth reading and rereading. And she's still teaching. I think she's at Birkbeck now. She was at Queen Mary for a while in London. Anyway, so all these conflicts are going on. So Deleuze and Guattari are really immersed in a real battle here. And I mean, maybe Richard could speak to this, but there were many court cases of who had the Lacanian legacy, right? And there were battle lines really set up. And Alain Badiou, on one hand, considered himself the heir to Lacan, right, in a way. And you had these factions, of course, that centered around Lacan's son-in-law, Jacques-Alain Millier, and many splits within that group, and many groups that, you know, divided out. So this is when they speak of conflict, yes, psychoanalysis, as Freud said, like a church, right? In many ways, many of the, you know, practitioners, the analysts, you know, were fighting with each other and really battling for, you know, the inheritance and the goods, right? Just who is the real Freud, you know, et cetera, or, you know, how do we get this legacy of Lacan? So as we know, Millier has been very slow in letting out many of the texts in translation into English, right? They've been very, you know, for lack of a better term, anal about it for many, many years. Lacan has been dead since I think he died 1980, if I'm not mistaken, or 81. You know, he was 80 years old when he passed away, but born in 1900. Anyway, so I want us to remember this. I mean, I think it's good to have some kind of, you know, historicity at work here, or to historicize, you know, what the stakes are somewhat in this book and what they're trying to do vis-a-vis the psychoanalytic and also, I think, the communist legacy in both levels here, operative throughout, and you know what their stakes are. And I want to keep returning to this as we go forward because it gives us more of a location and a way of thinking through some of the elements here. So this materialist psychiatry, of which they are going to say they are Reichians in this regard, and this is again on page 35, where they say that what their task is, and I'll go back and read that quickly. Let me just see if I can get the right page. I have a very bottom overhead light here. You know, this is what they really want to do, is found this new materialist psychiatry. You know, this begins the whole section 22 through 30, 35, 36, up to the machines, right? So this is what they really want to do. The materialist psychiatry is on the drawing board. And I'm going to quote one thing that they said about Marx, and this is interesting too, and we'll return to this as we go forward. Marx notes, what exists in fact is not lack, but passion as a natural and sensuous object. This is very nice. Desire is not bolstered by needs, but rather the contrary. Needs are derived from desire. They are counter products within the real that desire produces. Lack is a counter effect of desire. It is deposited, distributed, vacuolized within a real that is natural and social. And desire always remains in close touch with the conditions of objective existence and embraces them, follows them, shifts when they shift, and does not outlive them. For that reason, it often becomes the desire to die, whereas need is a measure of the withdrawal of a subject that has lost its desire at the same time that it loses the passive synthesis of these conditions. Anyway, this is on page 27. Very interesting quote from Marx, that passion as a natural and sensuous object in the world. One thing that they are speaking about, and the desire of versus that of need, right? In many ways. Then again, the bottom, another major figure here besides Marx, and we've mentioned this again, and I know I read this before, but I want to reiterate, the true visionary is a Spinoza in the garb of a Neapolitan revolutionary. We knew very well where lack and its subjective correlative come from. Lack is created, and this is important again, page 28. Lack is created, planned, and organized in and through social production. It is counterproduced as a result of the pressure of anti-production. The latter falls back on the forces of productions and appropriated them. It is never primary. Production is never organized on the basis of a pre-existing need or lack. It is lack that infiltrates itself and creates empty spaces or vacuoles and propagates itself in accordance with the organization of an already existing organization of production. The deliberate creation of lack as a function of market economy, important, is the art of a dominant class. Okay, again, I repeat, the deliberate creation of lack as a function of market economy is the art of a dominant class. This involves deliberately organizing wants and needs amid an abundance of production, making all of desire teeter and fall victim to the great fear of not having one's needs satisfied, and making the object dependent upon a real production that is supposedly exterior to desire, that is, the demands of rationality, while at the same time the production of desire is categorized as as fantasy and nothing but fantasy. Yeah, this is very interesting. And then they go into no distinction between social production of reality on the one hand and desire and production that is mere fantasy on the other. There are only connections that are established between those two poles. So very interestingly enough, they really understand, and I think Carl had as a professor the person that wrote, Richard Lichtman, The Production of Desire, how desire is actually produced by market economy, how it is, in a sense, for them, they understand this in terms of lack and desire, that relationship. Whereas again, this notion of desiring production is a term they're using in order to synthesize, if you will, early on, Marx and Freud. It is trying to bring the production and the production of production. I want to keep that in mind. There's only desire in the social and nothing else. So again, they're really trying to get away from this whole notion of need, right? Number one, and also away from everything is still happening on the interior. There is no interior for Deleuze and Guattari. Parting in life, the aesthetic bourgeois interior is not, part of their journey here or their working hypotheses. Richard, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to say something? Yeah.
No.
Oh, okay. All right. So to go back to this, desire is always striving. It's always striving to be more. And in a way, it's always striving to become other, to become different, right? It is an interminable becoming. I know David mentioned last week interminable and interminable analysis, the non-ending analysis, Freud's last text, I think, if I'm not mistaken, that was mentioned. So this is an internal becoming without being. And within desire, there's never a distinction between producing and its product. This is never a distinction going on, and there's never a fixed identity for them. It's continuous, qualitative multiplicities that are categorized by degrees of difference and not differences of degrees. So this is interesting, right? The degrees of difference are being positioned here, not differences of degrees for them. Okay, I wanted to mention a couple of other things just for clarification, and I'll try to do this much more logically next week and get us really up to speed, in a more, presentative mode. But anyway, the word machine is used in the literal and not the metaphoric nor figural sense, right? It's understood to highlight and emphasize the central characteristic of desire. It should never be reduced, machine, to mechanism, right? Never to mechanism, because mechanism is a closed process within a machine or a technological machine, or a specific organization of a living person or being organized to the activities of a given end. So it's non-teleological, non-aim directed as well, yeah, in many ways. Okay, so desire as a machine is a multiplicity of desiring activities. It's nothing more than its connections. It has no closed identity. Desire is a machine. There's no identity where you say, this is your desire, or this is what's going on. So I want us to keep this in mind going forward. And I'm going to return to the three texts of Freud for a second too. Again, Oedipus for Deleuze and Guattari, hence the title again, Anti-Oedipus, is the great agent, they say this, the great agent of anti-production in desire. It is a way of, and this is because of the castrated anxiety. And in capitalism, the Marxist notion of the enchanted, miraculated world, the world that is filled with the fetish and the magic of the marketplace and the magic of the object, etc. So I wanted to ground us again. Remember, they are really attempting here to ground a new practice, if you will, that we will see later, I hope, with the schizoid analysis, right? As a, I'm not going to say replacement, but a new way of looking at quote unquote mental health, care for the self, et cetera, as we go forward. A new materialist psychiatry. They're trying to really engage this. Okay, I want to go back to some things we did last week. Unless there are any thoughts about today's reading, I can certainly, begin with specific questions. But I had something in mind about going back to the three texts of Freud. I don't think we mentioned I think David mentioned one of them. The other two were not mentioned. One was, of course, Judge Schreber. The three texts of Freud was the first text, and this was about the sodomization of fantasies by the rays of the sun. He was being sodomized by God, and then that their reading of the Schreber case, and I'll do something too here, is that Freud posthumously was Oedipalized, Schreber, brought him back to the father, right? And by the way, his father was the founder of a school where Nietzsche went to school, by the way. It was a very special, we call it preparatory school in Germany. His father was a famous educational person, Daniel Paul Schreber's father, the judge. Okay, I wanted to say one thing about the case studies. There are 5 major case studies that Freud, that we read in schools, right, so to speak. We have, of course, and I'm going to do this with the fingers, the one hand, if you will, of the case studies. In some ways, you have the judge, the middle finger, right? Here, Dora, the thumb, the rat man, and the wolf man, and then little Hans as so really the task that Freud sets upon himself, I think empirically through the case studies, is to think the unconscious, which was between the judge, right, and paranoia, right, and to be posthumously Oedipalized, and of course the case of the female hysteric Dora. Yeah, so you're thinking through that circle, right, bounded by the 2 other case studies, the Wolfman, Ratman, and of course little Hans, which was where Freud understood transference in a different way in that moment, the case of little Hans. So I think we can work with that. So the question that Deleuze and Guattari raise in terms of this first reading of a text, and Schreber's text is called Memoirs of a Nervous Illness. It's available in English. He wrote about it, his breakdowns and his paranoid reaction, is they ask the question, why return to myth, right? And they go through a whole thing with Jung and Freud. And this is interesting too. Why do we return to myth? And, for me, I return to myth in the sense of trying to set up the 20th century, that we have the 3 great myths of the 20th century in a way. Prometheus, that we're always going to go well beyond. We're going to steal the fire from the gods. We're going to give it to the people. We're going to always go beyond in some ways. Of course, that's part of the Faustian bargain that we have engaged in, that Marcuse very well puts out in Eros and Civilization. The second one, of course, is the myth of Sisyphus. We're always trying to push the rock up the mountain, where the new Stoicism, we get close to the top, it falls on us and we have to start over again. So we're always in that, in Leninist terminology, 1 step forward, 2 steps back is a kind of myth of Sisyphus on the left. We're always, a little step forward, but 2 steps back, sometimes 3 steps back. And now sometimes we don't really even know what step to take, which is has become a problem. And then, of course, what Stiegler comes up with is the Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother, who lived by the default that we are determined by techniques from the outside, right? In a way, we are shaped by the tools. We are shaped by the techniques in time, in a way. So we have these three modern myths. Now, why a reversion to this? I guess it gives a narrative, and this is what Deleuze and Guattari want to, kind of get out of, because they see this as going into religion and other aspects, right? This is in the section where they take on, Freud and Jung and the split and how close they really are. One in terms of the atheism, and the other in terms of the religion. Jung had a great interest in religion, and especially Eastern religions. But he had he was a Protestant ultimately. So this is interesting too. So anyway, this whole notion of myth, right? And of course, what is the central myth again for them is this myth of Oedipus, right? Again, they want to get out of this. Why does this happen? Why are they going back? And they mention, again, the interesting thing, and the reason I wanted to go back to this section is they have an engagement with the cure, right? They have an engagement of what therapy is supposed to do. And I'm going to go on to that too. Someone who's really forgotten in psychoanalytic circles, Andre Green, who was a member of the Lacanian machinery, and they had a break. In the 60s, as early as the 60s, Andre Green. The book I read was The Tragic Effect of his, but they cite his book on affect, very, very interesting psychoanalyst there. And he goes through the three types of sessions. But again, the other two case histories, the child is being beaten, and David, please correct me if I'm wrong in terms of this presentation, or if you can add to it, I'm more than open, that they go into this in group fantasies and how this works, and how, if you break out of the Oedipal triangles, you go into another one, right, where you begin to see this as part of the social effects. And they use these examples of the Vietnamese, the soldiers in Vietnam, and how much play they would say something like, it's so bad, but it's also so good, being beaten by the Marine sergeant, or, the relationship of the girls looking at the boy being disciplined by the teacher, etc. And they go through this on the level of fantasy. And this is obviously Guattari speaking, because they had a lot of experiments at the board clinic with group fantasy, and looking at this and how they would break this, Oedipal triangulation and see this as part of the social. And this is their idea, I think, in a way that, that John Uri, O-U-R-Y, was conducting at the board clinic, this kind of investigation into group fantasies. So this is, again, very important. I think also they have a nice, interesting attempt to look at two regimes, one of perversion and one of subversion. This is very interesting too, that the analytic session, if it's really good, understands, in the traditional sense, the perversion operating, but it also has the subversive moment. And of course, I know some of you have read Lacan. The subversion of the subject and the dialectic of desire is very much on this level, how the subject is subverted and then put into this dialectic of desire, which in some ways, and we'll talk about this when I get to Green, in some ways, the model, if you will, for the good session, right? The good psychoanalytic session that Green speaks about, what is real realistically. The third text, as far as I can tell, is what you were talking about very, very nicely last week, David, the interminable and terminal analysis, right? That it never ends. And their problem with this was more that, the problem is that it takes in, the question that the narration never has an ending, right? they're having a problem. They have a problem with this, right? And they want to talk more about the flows, right? In this sense, that the flows go on, right? And again, they're substituting this for, the story never ends, right? We always can come back and tell more and tell more and tell more, etc. So they're taking on that third text. So the three texts, again, Schreber the paranoiac, right? In some ways that they claim Freud re-Oedipalizes posthumously, right? And, makes into another kind of, Oedipal myth, if you will, and Oedipal, complex playing out. And then, of course, the child is being beaten, in which group fantasy is being, talked about. And for those of you interested in this clinically, and I think there are at least 5 or 6 of you, the Serge Leclerc's great book, A Child is Being Beaten, which is available in English. He was a Lacanian who studied this. It's called The Child is Being Beaten. Yeah. And another thing, why how this work of sadism and masochism is working, and in some senses, going back to one of the, and I refer to this text a lot. I think it should be read every year. I'm going to let this person in. I don't think Matt may have checked out. Okay. Anyway, the rereading of the Frankfurt Schools, especially Adorno's piece and of Horkheimer's piece on Sade and Nietzsche, right? On, I think it was called Juliet or Enlightenment. Yeah. And this is a very, very, very beautiful attempt to look at the presence of the Marquise de Sade in today's world and this kind of libidinal economy that's set up. And it's no accident that Kloskowski, Maurice Blanchot, and others all went back to Sade at a particular time. And there was a volume in French, Shall We Burn Sade, right? And as you know, Sade was the antagonist of the French Revolution in many ways of this moment, and there's an interesting trace here from Sade to Nietzsche that happens in Kloskowski. So anyway, I'm going there because I think that they're thinking this way too, right, in many ways. And as I mentioned, Lacan's relationship to Sade is to formalize the perversions, in a reading of the critique of and the categories of pure reason, right, in a certain way, that psychoanalytic reading of philosophy. So this is interesting too, because Immanuel Kant is living the same time as, the Marquise de Sade, et cetera. So again, okay, so we have these three texts, right? The child is being beaten, analysis, terminal and interminable, and of course the Schreber, they're going on. But I thought the very interesting part here is, again, the desiring economy, the things that prevent obstacles to treatment. And I think this is very important for our time, because I think if any time when we've needed the best clinicians out there and practitioners of, psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, whatever you want to call it, militant schizoid analysis, et cetera, is now, right? There's no question in my mind where we are. So first of all, the prevent real treatment is the rock of castration. They are really going after this. This is constantly going on. We can critique this, we can go back to this, but again, this is something that is happening all the time. The qualitative aptitude for conflict, that there's always this, conflict that comes up somewhat in the psychoanalytic movements, beginning with the antagonisms early on of Adler, Jung, and Freud, right, if you will, as the first movement of conflicts in the psychoanalytic movement. And the type of resistance that is eliminated is that's non-localizable. The types of resistance, which is the viscous libido, the liquid one, and nothing really takes hold. So, somehow the qualitative flows of libido or of desire are not really looked at sometimes in the psychoanalytic scene. Now I'm going to go on to Andre Green. I want to make clear again, I'm not a clinician, and I welcome people to talk about this. This is basically on page, this is on page 66, Andre Green, fine pages. Andre Green recently took up the question again by making a list of 3 types of sessions. And I think this is very, very good. This is something that can really help us understand this book better, and etc. Type 1 is based on the viscosity, the resistance of the historical form, of a hysterical form. You know, he speaks to this. And he goes on, the session is dominated by a heavy, weighty, boggy climate. The silences are leaden. The discourse is dominated by the events of the day. I did this today, doctor. I woke up, you know, et cetera, et cetera. It's uniform. Descriptive narration where no reference to the past is disclosable. It unfolds along a continuous thread. I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this, et cetera, right? Unable to allow itself any break. The dreams are narrated. The enigma dream is taken up in secondary elaboration that makes dream as narration and as event take precedence as dream as a working over of thoughts. This is very good. This is very, very solid to my mind. A very good way of looking at, you know, the psychopathology every day life and your own self-analysis, right, in many ways. A sticky transference. So he's very good at this, right? Okay, so according, then type 2. And type 2, I put as you uttering without changing, right? It's just uttering thoughts, right? So he goes on to that. The liquidity resistance of the obsessional form. So the hysteric, one type, is the first one, right? That has to, the hysteric just gives you the events days. I brushed my teeth. I went to work. I did this at work. That same old person was in my way, you know, at the water fountain or whatever. You know, you can build the narration on that. But type 2, the obsessional form, right? Here the session is dominated by extreme mobility of representations of all sorts, right? A kind of like massive jump cut without stopping, you know, in terms of the film to say, wait, take a step back. Let's take a look at a long take or something different than the jumping cuts and the quick narration. You know, and maybe you could look at this cinematically, that the newsreel reportage, right, of a daily thing is part of the first type of the hysteric that he's talking about, the resistance of the hysterical form. And the second with the obsessional is more like the jump cut, you know, in filmic language. All right, so so everything is, the language is unfettered, it's rapid, almost torrential. Everything enters here. The patient could just as easily say the opposite of everything, right? Nothing's taking hold, right? He's uttering without changing anything fundamental to the analytical situation. All of this is without consequence, since the analysis slides off the couch like water on a duck's back. The unconscious does not cause anything to stick. There's no anchoring in the transference. And here the transference is completely volatile. So this is the second form. Yeah. Okay. Now the third form, only the third type remains, where the characteristics define a good analysis. So we go from the obsessional, the hysterical, to the good analysis, right? The hysterical, obsessional, now to the good analysis. And in the good analysis, the patient speaks in order to constitute the process of a chain of signifiers. The meaning is not attached to the signified to which each of the enunciated signifiers refers, but is constituted by process, suture, the concatenation of bound elements. Every interpretation furnished by the patient can offer itself as an already signified awaiting its meaning. For this reason, interpretation is always retrospective to the perceived meaning. So this is what was meant. So these are the three classic situations in which therapy, at least of the psychoanalytic type, engages. I don't know. I thought this was a very good approach they use here. Not that they're taking this up in their way, right? But they're pointing out these are the descriptions of three different types: the hysterical, the obsessional, and then the one that wants to change really undergoes analysis. The other two surface, right? In a sense, just show up. The people that are staying in analysis 20, 30 years, at least of my generation. I know people, anyway, yeah. I know a lot of people, they got to go back, they got to return, et cetera, et cetera. Something didn't take hold. And, Bruno and I together came up with a form called taking it back, taking something back as a revolutionary moment, right? Going back and taking the meaning from the past. This is the hysteric and the obsessional are incapable of doing this. This is kind of interesting. And we can maybe read this socially in terms of psychological types, if you want. I'm just, offering some suggestions here. To how is it that we get into movement politics, if you will, or we get into, certain efforts of our own in everyday life to make things change? We're usually dealing with either the hysteric or the obsessional as types, right? Who somehow it's sliding in one sense, and in the other sense, it's just a kind of a because just kind of a flow without anything, right? And the leadenness of the silences, no affect, kind of leads to an apathy, an apathia without any kind of action, etc. So I thought this was a very good section and something we should understand going forward. It is part of something that we could take that they offer here, vis-a-vis not their own thinking. It's through Andre Green, and that I'm putting out there. So, I mean, any thoughts about this so far? Because this is really what they're trying to do here. Look, again, it is this attack on the bedrock of psychoanalytic thinking, castration anxiety. Yeah, and in a way. And they want to begin to look at this in a very different way, through this concept of desire and production. But at the same time, they're very respectful of the, as I said, of the taking back of something, right? What is best in the movement of psychoanalysis? What can we really take from it, moving forward? And I think this is very important to know, as well as with Marx, in some ways, Marx had a concept called fictitious capital. It's not adequate to what we're going through today in financialization. We can work with it, but we have to constantly revise, redefine it, etc., because of the changing circumstances. And it might not be, in Spinoza's terms, an adequation to what is in reality as a concept, right? It's not adequate. Yeah. So any thoughts about this so far? I wanted to, again, they have a way of being textual. Yes, Justin. Yeah, good. Yeah, please. Yeah. You're muted.
Sorry, it took me a while to unmute.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
So I don't know much of anything about psychology and all that sorts of thing. I've never been particularly interested.
Okay.
But I have been interested in Guattari's work. And so, with Thousand Plateaus being, quite used by a lot of people in all sorts of different fields, it's always Deleuze this, Deleuze that, but very rarely Guattari. And as we're going through this particular chapter that we read, it's all psychology. And so the question is, why is Guattari not mentioned as much, it seems, in what people write?
Because he was a militant who, ran guns for many of the militant organizations. He was, he was a man in the middle of the moment, right, so to speak. This was a person that was incredibly behind his words of his militancy. It wasn't just an academic exercise or something you do just at the university or at the clinic. He took it to the world. And I think there was maybe a hostility that he went a little bit too far. Deleuze was a, mild-mannered, philosophy professor in a way, very radical in his way, but in a way, this speaking, this group fantasy, and the whole thing about psychoanalysis is much more Guattari than it is Deleuze speaking. I mean, you can tell, he's the one that was formed both by Lacan and Jean Houry. He had the best, in a way. I mean, I'm tremendously, enamored of Jacques Lacan's contribution in the 20th century. There's no question that this was most radical reworking of Freud in my mind. I mean, maybe not the most radical militant use of Freud, but certainly the most radical reappropriation. and something that happened. And he had also this clinic in which these group fantasies and experiments were taking place. So you can kind of think it like, this again, I think what he wants to get away from is this kind of notion of the couch and the psychodrama of the theatrical representations of the daddy, mind, mommy, me triangulation, and what that means culturally. He's trying to extend that into the, the cultural field. And they're going to really talk about this as a kind of, they use the language of Lenin, they use the language of the communist movements, the imperialism of Oedipus. And they make some interesting connections later between, and this is the stuff very good dissertations are made of, Adam Smith and Freud. It's very interesting their relationship to the wealth of nations and how Freud may be situated through somewhat the Scottish Enlightenment. And, so there are a lot of, moments here. So I don't know exactly how to answer your question, but he was very militant in the world as a practitioner, etc. Right? And yeah. And Lydia is asking, is the French what? I'm sorry. Yeah. Lydia, you have a question? I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm seeing the stuff in the thing. Yeah. Okay. Oh, bad connection tonight. Okay. So I don't know if that answers. I mean, he did come to New York. He lectured at Cooper Union and was, was known in certain circles, but never had the machine. Deleuze is a household, as you know. I mean, in terms of academia and all of that. But Deleuze is a professional philosopher of a first rank. I mean, he's anti-philosophy, but he's, a professional philosopher. But, they wrote What is Philosophy together, which is a good way of maybe understanding, too, what they're doing here. And, and I think they both had a certain kind of hostility to what they saw was the lack of treatment in French psychoanalyst practice, right? Horror stories, right, etc. There are a lot of horror stories out there, as you can imagine, right? Too. Yeah. Please.
So, and then this is very old.
Well, I mean, to some people's minds, yes.
No, but this is. I mean, this is basically when I was born. Okay.
Fair enough.
So it's been a long time, and I don't know like how much does this exist in psychology. So for example, I have a few friends. And this is
zero.
Okay.
Zero. Freud doesn't exist in psychology
right.
anymore. Right. I mean, in departments in some ways. I mean, maybe other people can speak to this, but yes, we're dominated by a new form of behaviorism, cognitive psychology, dialectical, behaviorism, all this kind of stuff at this point. So yeah, Freud, Lacan are no longer in the clinic, never really were dominated in psychology departments, but they were always as a section, right? And there was a cultural thing when you were maybe 10 years old in the 1980s, late 70s until maybe the middle to late 80s, where this was part of everyday life, culture. People were talking about repression all the time, or, that became a kind of crucial verb or whatever. So yeah, Carl, go ahead. I'll come back to you, Justin. Good question. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking we've given up Freud and Lacan and embraced life coaching.
Oh yeah, well that's a kind of inside joke too, as you know. Stuart Schneiderman, with all due respect, who did some very good work over the years, quit his practice as a Lacanian analyst and his very good presentations on the clinical Lacan back in the 80s, and now as a life coach, right? There's probably more money in it. You can go to athletes with their millions of dollars when they have to change identities. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I mean, just to, throw this out, what other people thought about this, but, reading this chapter, it seemed to me that they're very strong about, and I found a lot of the critique compelling about, this kind of deconstruction of the Oedipal regime, right? And this assertion of this very different logic inside the psyche and the unconscious. But I wonder if they get beyond that moment, like and where this really, like, I would be really curious where this leads to in terms of clinical practice, and I guess later on we'll talk about political practice. But it seems like they are proposing that clinical practice and interventions can themselves become part of a larger radical militant political practice, which I think is very, very common, R.D. Laing and, radical therapy and all these types of things. Right. It seems that's just really gone by the wayside, which is a whole nother conversation.
Yes.
I guess I just, that it's kind of compelling, but then you ask, like, what are really the organizing principles that they're proposing in this unconscious apparatus, process, entity, organism? And it seems a little more vague at that point. And there are organizing principles.
I think one way of reading this, and I'm trying to go through this. Look, it's a very a book of multiple levels. So, obviously, not this duality of these multiple personas and interpretive fellows sitting around coming up with this kind of work and then trying to organize it into something. You have to remember it's based on a critical destruction first. They're basically bulldozing, if you will, trying to clear the ground before they're going to get to what they're going to propose, which is schizoid analysis, which is the last part of the book. And I don't want to jump the gun. I think we should really see what the stakes are for them. And again, I'm not advocating for them. I'm just trying to follow somewhat their logic in the book and their methodology. And their method is really to take this on by critical destruction, and not in a pious way, and not in an I agree to disagree kind of way. This is not happening here. This is a smashing time and time again. If you read it, in terms of what it's doing phenomenologically, it's a destruction of what's going on. Yeah, in many ways. Yeah, it's like Marx for a relentless critique of everything existing, right? Right, in many ways. So Marx will, look at an Adam Smith, and very much like they look at Freud, right? And he'll say, okay, yes, I see this, and labor is the source of value, but this isn't it, right? This is not what capital is about, right? And it goes to another level, So there's this respect going on consistently for Freud, for Lacan, for the psychoanalytic practices. They go in and they want to look at, the cure and the treatment early on, and they're going into what good sessions look like. And I think they're very fair here, because they're not saying we're going to throw out all of psychoanalysis. They bring up Andre Green, who is a practicing psychoanalyst, right? And in a sense, and they're really trying to talk about what makes for a good session. So when you ask this question, it's very hard to answer, right away until we get to their proposals, which are not until the end of the book, right? Until the latter part, the schizoid analysis, which again leads into what Justin was, mentioning earlier, Mille Plateaux, 1,000 Plateaus, which is a kind of, next effort of theirs, in a way. Yeah, so I don't know, if that helps, but this is a critical destruction in the phenomenological sense, right? They're paving the way. There's a lot of suspension, epoches at work here, where they're trying to go to a different level. They're working on multiple planes, I think, at once, and I'll try to do that as much textually. But the central figures, characters, if you want to look at it in the book and the theories, are Wilhelm Reich and his break with the psychoanalytic thing, and the relationship of social and psychic repression, right? And they want to get out of the notion of psychic repression. Justin's on to something that he doesn't know much about psychology, and that's good. He's going to see this book in a good light, in many ways, because that distorts much of what they're trying to do here. There's only the socius. That's the starting point. It's very much what Marx says in the German ideology. Consciousness is not born before it's social relations that determine consciousness. For Deleuze and Guattari, it is the socius that's determining everything. That's what they're trying to get to. And they come up again with this attempt through this concept called desiring production, right? To begin this new relationship between, nature, society, and the self, if you will.
It seems to me they're also although I'm really out of
Sure.
my area of but they're also critiquing Lacan, and it seems like very much the representational theory of language, the Saussurian theory of language, and I found that very interesting. And what they said about, language doesn't represent; it produces effects, and that's when language really comes alive.
Right. I'm not so sure Lacan would disagree with that, but anyway, that's
I was if anyone had wanted to comment on that, because I know earlier we had talked a little bit when they were talking about the disjunctive synthesis,
right.
And then the later part where that they talk about the bricks and sort of this, and as I think that's kind of where they're talking some about language,
right?
Symbol, but it's not like the theater; it's not represent. So I just, if anyone had,
sure. I'll open it up, but let me just make one remark here. Part of the problem of Wilhelm Reich to the psychoanalytic community is there was not that emphasis upon language. In Freud's case and in Lacan's case, language is absolutely central, not for Wilhelm Reich, right? And I'm not so sure how much for, I think, Guattari less than Deleuze. Deleuze really reads linguistic theory, etc., whereas Guattari is more interested in just connections of flows and stuff like this. Very different in this way. Yeah, much more to Justin's generation, I think, in a lot of ways too. Yeah, yeah. Much like Derrida, the end of the book, right? And the beginning of writing, the first section. Remember, telegrammatology, look, I said this at the beginning, there's a theoretical matrix at work here that's happening. Of course, the Lacanian schools and the Center for Epistemological Research, of which Jacques-Alain Millier was a member of, very high-powered group at the Sorbonne in 1964. And of course, you have 1967, Derrida publishes Telegrammatologie, right? Difference in repetition of Deleuze is 68. Logique des sens, this is 72, right? Foucault's Order and Things, or Words and Things, is a much better translation, in which representation is taken on. So this question of representation, ever since Heidegger, Being in Time, and of course Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, has been out there as a major, a moment in philosophical and I think also in psychoanalytic thinking, right? In many ways. Yeah. So Chris, you wanted to say something? Yeah. And yeah.
Oh no, I the only thought I had right now is that both Deleuze and Guattari and Derrida have an attack on the signifier from different ends. We're reading about what Deleuze and Guattari is saying about the signifier as the capitalist body, but what Derrida does in De la Grammatologie is to say that the signifier slides continuously until and never makes sense and never has a definite sign. It's metonymic for Derrida.
Right. No, it's true. Yeah. So again, this was a very rich period with linguistics. Saussure was also taken on by Derrida and De la Grammatologie, as you know, in the first part devoted to that, second part to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and very interesting look. And Rousseau also wrote on the origin of language. So language becomes very important, obviously, to the French. It was Julia Kristeva who said that the role that language plays in the human sciences, the determinate role it plays, and she was Lacanian to the core in her early formation. So anyway, they are not. It's a very different linguistics. Yeah, Bruno, you wanted to say something?
Just especially about Carl's question. There is in a book by Lazzarato, which I just got right here now from. It's called Science and Machines, right? Yeah. And there is a very interesting chapter on Guattari and the question of the distinction between discursive and existential. communication. And so, I mean, I just wanted to suggest
that's
that.
very good. That's a book worth reading. And Justin, that'll give you a nice, interesting approach to this, because Lazzarato was a student in Deleuze's classes in the early 70s, right? And, he's taken this up in a very interesting and clear way. And this book, Science and Machines, is very interesting in this distinction that goes on between the discursive practices and the existentiality of language. And, Guattari was very much back into subjectivity later. He went back there in some ways, even though you don't really see subjectivity at work here. He returns to that in a way. Yeah.
Go ahead. Although the way he deals with subjectivity is really singularity, by the way, I think so. I mean, conceptually, although he still uses the word subjectivity.
Yes, he uses the term, but conceptually, you're right, singularity. Right. David, you've been unmuted, so Did you want to add
a little brief vignette on the idea of how psychoanalysis and theories like this fare in the actual world of publishing. But someone we were talking about last week a little bit, Alan Bass, this guy who translated Derrida into English, had a very interesting book in the 90s before Bush #2 took power that was going to be published by Stanford University Press on difference and disavowal, which took on Lacan and some of these things. And that I remember walking with him after this little seminar, and he was very upset because Stanford actually, under Condoleezza Rice, who no one knew who she was really then, had actually pushed the book out as being subversive, sexual, un-American, and twisted.
There we go.
Those words.
It's all very positive terms coming out of her mouth. But anyway, I'm sorry.
But as it turns out,
I apologize for any.
But under the aegis of Condoleezza, pre-Bush, who was then the provost of Stanford, who had her oversight of this press, that she actually did totally close down their line of psychoanalytic studies as too subversive, and that the way the book was published was through the Stanford line in philosophy, which could tolerate it because it was a more open thing. But luckily, major other academic presses haven't followed that model. But it is a very disturbing aspect of censorship in our world that would say a book like that would, really be considered something that just would have to be, suppressed in this terrible way. What I was thinking a little bit in a different train is...
I understand,
Yeah, but if we kind of think about the economic problem of masochism and the child is being beaten, which is really just about Anna Freud herself and her fantasies with Freud as her analyst father, how interesting is this to be analyzed by your dad? But that what happened there was really his idea that the spanking fantasy was a classic Oedipal guilt regression from the desire to have full-on sex with Freud in the classic sense. So the spank had a tremendous power of saying, this is the sublimated form of the sex.
Right.
It's where I can go without full penetration or without vaginal awareness to saying, but my butt is being spanked by daddy, and there's a tremendous charge to it. And I think where, as I see it, Deleuze and Guattari are not fully getting Freud in some way.
Okay, fair enough,
is I don't think they see his potential voltage of saying, if the analysand, in this case Anna, could realize the power of the spank, the fantasy, the idea that the repetition of it is not, as a repetition compulsion often does, pushing something out of consciousness by experientially reducing it by saying, I don't have to think about what's going on, I'm just so lost in getting spanked, but it's saying, I'm in my analysis thinking, why is the spanking so hot? Why do I want a daddy to spank me? There is something potentially liberating in the way that energy would be released. Right. It wouldn't be quite so physical, political as Reich saying you've discovered the orgastic self, so your body is just moving in a way you would never tolerate repression. But it does feel like there's a bridge out of individual neurosis into a potential transformation that I don't quite see. They kind of see him as having a certain powerful, almost Nietzschean embodiment of saying, you could use your perversion and use it well to say, what am I succumbing to and why? I wouldn't necessarily, if I really analyzed that spanking fantasy, be submitting to desiring my servitude, but would be an active desire of something where I might be in a scene where I'm being sort of spanked and overpowered, but I could really be quite liberated if I understood why I wanted that, and it might not be such a servitude, but a way of getting what I want.
Right, right. Do you mind if I go to the text for a second based on what you're saying to
sure.
the I want to turn us to page 61 of what David is speaking to in the Anti-Oedipus. He says, let us return, they say, let us return to the fantasy a child is being beaten. Children are beaten. A typical group fantasy. This is their take on this, and I want to go there after what you very eloquently presented, where desire invests the social field and its repressive forces. If there is a mise en scène, it is directed by a social desiring machine, whose product should not be considered abstractly, separating the girls' and boys' cases, as if each were a little ego taking up its own business with daddy and mommy. On the contrary, and this is Guattari speaking, I think mostly here, but in connection, right? We should consider the complementary ensemble made up of boy, girl, and parent agents of production and anti-production. This ensemble being present at the same time in each individual and in the socius that presides over the organization of the group fantasy. Simultaneously, the boys are beaten, initiated by the teacher on the little girl's erotic stage as a seeing machine, and obtain satisfaction in a masochistic fantasy involving the mother, anal machine. The result is that the boys are able to see only by becoming little girls, and the girls cannot experience the pleasure of punishment except by becoming boys. It is a whole chorus, a montage. Back in the village, after a raid in Vietnam, in the presence of their weeping sisters, the filthy Marines are beaten by their instructor on whose knees the mommy is seated, and they have orgasms for having been so evil, for having tortured so well. It's so bad, but also so good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this is the way I think they're kind of reading it again from the outside. And please comment on this, but I think this is interesting in the way they try to displace, right, if you will, or go to the outside and say, this is again part of this socius and the social field that's doing this, and it's directed through desiring production. But please, yeah.
No, it's a fascinating part of it. It feels like, it's so vivid and so visceral. What I was confused about, Michael, is whether for them there is a way of saying, but that group fantasy might have an anagogical potential to transform the community by being made public and understood in a collectivity, or whether it's a form of pathology. That's the part of them I don't fully feel like I understand yet.
Yeah, I think for them, ideally, if you want to look at this ideally, I don't know how it will play out, but ideally, yes, the former is the case. They would like this analogically to play out as collective liberation and collective design in some ways, an understanding of this as such, right? In many ways, right? Mm-hmm. And they're reading again, how do you read the things how do you read, the problems in the Russian Revolution? How do you read a character like Nikolai Bukharin, who's ready to risk his life as a young man, everything, and then is on his knees, right, before the Politburo and the show trials in 1936 and 37. How do we read this kind of servitude that takes place, in terms of something that started out so well, right? And, where he started out so well. How is this inverted, not analogically to collective desire, right? This is what they're trying to come back to, Why wouldn't Bukharin be somebody a bit different? Karl Radek, et cetera, during the communist movements. What happens to Victor Tosk, with Sigmund Freud, in a sense. So I think these are all the levels. But yes, I think you're absolutely right. This can be taken up in another way too, as a pathology. And maybe the best thing for us to do is think of it both, right? How one turns the pathology into an analogical liberation, right? In some ways. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I'm not a clinician, I try to, yeah, to think this through on the level of care and the level of where we are. But, this is part of, yeah. Again, the clinician here is Guattari. Deleuze is the conceptual, work at work here. So if you can kind of think of this, he's the one doing this experiments with the group fantasies, right? And they're also reading, the next thing is the film Hearts and Minds with General Patton. I don't know if you remember this, right? I'll read it quickly and then I'll go to you, Chris. Perhaps one will recall a sequence from the film Hearts and Minds. We see Colonel Patton, the general's son, saying the guys are great. They love their mothers, their fathers, and their country, right? That they cry at the religious services for their dead bodies. Fine boys. Then the colonel's face changes. It grimaces and reveals a big paranoiac in uniform who shouts in conclusion, but still, there's a bloody good bunch of killers, right? Right? And right? They go to church on Sunday, right? So it is obvious that when traditional psychoanalysis explains that the instructor is the father, and that the colonel too is the father, and that the mother is nonetheless the father too, right? It reduces all of desire to a familiar determination that no longer has anything to do with the social field actually invested by the libido. Again, the social field is key here. I'm not advocating for them, but if we have to keep in mind, it is always this social field that is presupposed throughout this, right? It is not just the individual pathology, or really for that matter, the group pathology, right? It is the social field and its investments of flows, energies, et cetera, et cetera. So, of course, there's always something from the father or the mother that is taken up by the significant chain, daddy's mustache, et cetera, right? The mother's raised arm. But it comes furtively to occupy a place among the collective agents, right? The terms of Oedipus do not form a triangle, but exist shattered into all, and this is interesting. I think this passage is crucial to what you're bringing up, David. Into all corners of the social field, the mother on the instructor's knees, the father's next to the colonel. Group fantasy is plugged into and machined on the socius, being fucked by the socius, wanting to be fucked by the socius, does not derive from the father and the mother, even though the father and the mother have their roles there as subordinate agents of transmission or of execution. So I think that's, part of what they're, again, trying to do through the social field. I don't know, you want to comment on this? I mean, I'm all ears, in terms of a really good active dialogue on this kind of stuff, because I think it's very important for us to understand this, yeah, in a way, yeah.
I'm still absorbing it a bit, Michael.
Okay. I mean, I want to say that, again, this is about, this presupposed desiring machine that's also in the socius always, right? You have to remember this. And that Oedipus is a secondary, right? Familiarization, holy familiarization is secondary phenomena, secondary revision to their dominant, theme is that desire is basically a social, moment, right? And the synthesis of Marx and Freud is always already operative, right? Yes. So pathology is completely social, right? It's the group pathology, as you were talking about earlier. Can that group pathology be, talked about as a perversion that can be then analogically put into a kind of subversion, right? And understanding a new way of looking at things. So yeah, let's keep that. Chris, go ahead. I see your hand's been up for a while.
Yeah, for a while. I think that we
it's okay.
Topics ago.
Yeah.
I want to get back to the desiring machine.
Yeah.
And it resonates so much for me with the passage from the Grundrisse, the fragment on machines that Marx wrote.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I see that as the theater in which Deleuze and Guattari are operating, because as Marx notes, the worker becomes an appendage of the machine.
Yes.
And becomes a desiring machine himself.
That's a very good point, and in a way, you can read Anti-Oedipus as a long commentary on pages 690 to 720 of the Grundrisse. I mean, I like that very much. The fragment on machines, that the Anti-Oedipus in some ways is an attempt to reread that in a contemporary light and bringing the best of, Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis to the table, if you will. I think this is a very good point. And when they say that the unconscious in the beginning, and again, we can keep this in mind, is not theatrical representation, it's not a theater, and those metaphors should not be used, it's a factory, right? In a way. And, again, their writers are the outsiders of the tradition, Céline, Henry Miller, Antonin Artaud, et cetera, et cetera. They're not the people that are dominant. For every Goethe, there must be a Kleist, right? Yeah. For, every Henry James, there must be a James Joyce, right? Something like that. They're looking at this in terms of, again, the literary and poetic production and filmic production of their times as well that they're bringing in. Yeah, go ahead, Chris. I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't mean.
Just want to add Proust, that Deleuze started.
He wrote on Proust, yeah, and Proust is obviously, the asthma machine, right? Yeah, that's what Proust is. So Proust is the asthma machine who locks himself up in the cork-filled room, right? And writes in search of lost time. Yeah, in a way, right? Absolutely. And, Malcolm Lowry is the under the volcano as a machine, right? In many ways, yeah. So they're looking again at this not, as machine, not as mechanisms, right? In a sense. And if we have to keep that separated throughout, these are desiring machines at work, right? Etc. Derrida is about the writing machine, right? In many ways. I mean, de la grammatologie is an attempt, a reflection on the writing machine. It's a very early attempt of the cyberspace that we're engaged in. It's very early on the scene. Yes, please.
He's attacking the metaphysics of the sign, Derrida.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So again, I think it's important. Yeah. Some other people, Richard, you had something. You disappeared. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Just two anecdotal things that came to my mind is that in French, the director, they don't say roll camera, they say moteur. That's the way. So it's interesting. I was just thinking of it in terms of the way of thinking about, the role of mechanism. And the other is in French slang, machin, which it's originally from Haitian, I think, is another kind of for machine, machin is a thing, but it, has this relation to, it's a cognitive machine, is this kind of these two kind of the associations in French of machine are, then you have la maîtrise, la maîtrise with l'homme machine, the man machine and everything. Just the associations of machine are very, very rich in French.
I know you're reading the book in French. Are you seeing a lot of wordplay? I mean, I don't have my copy, unfortunately, is in Canada, so I'm working with the English. I would do both, but are you seeing a lot of wordplay here and a lot of work? Yeah.
Of picking up on the slang of the period, a kind of a certain amount of wordplay. Different than Lacan's. Lacan's, tends to be very much about sounds of words that double. There is it's much more focused on you call French of the street or argot.
Argot. Yeah. That's what I gather. Yeah. David, you're still unmuted. Did you want to say something or yeah.
Well, I was thinking about their relationship to Hegel for a moment, where they seem very interested in kind of ending Hegel, so to speak, or something like that. Hegel obviously was very influential to Marx in that it feels like for Hegel, the dialectic of history will end in a positive way with the resolution of the master-slave dialectic. And it feels that very much influences Marx to say, ultimately the proletariat are going to rebel and that history can change. There's a utopia that's possible. In an individual psychology, it feels like Freud, with some movement back and forth, is kind of leading in that direction of saying, if you can shed your neurosis, something's over, the neurotic self dies, there would be something reborn. With Deleuze and Guattari, it seems like there's a kind of modern despair, as I hear them, which says, we see this all so clearly, but there's sort of no way out. That as I read this, I don't know if I'm getting them. It feels like there's a tremendous wisdom of saying, we understand how totalizing these systems of repression are, what it's like to be a scooped out desiring machine, all of that, where these theories have been interesting, but also in some ways elaborate failures of sorts. But I don't get a sense that they're able to say, but if you really understand this, there's some kind of real liberation you'd get. It almost reminds me of the film Sallow, where the crazy fascists in it are really quoting not them, but Klosowski and Philippe Soler and periods of l'expérience sans limite, to say, we've got all of that, and yet we're stuck in the infernal villa of Sallow, where nothing can happen. This is not the Marquis de Sade, really, where, as dark as his books were, it was about people being put together in sadomasochistic connections that had metaphoric openings of the way a stultifying society of an oligarchical structure of Marie Antoinette is thrown over, and now everybody is coming together in a strange new way. This feels like, in its own way, maybe I'm just reading it wrong, there's something kind of stultifying. There is no absolute spirit. There is no overcoming the sources of repression. There's just understanding it all better.
Right.
And then where do you go? I don't know. Michael.
I think for them, the stultifying moment still is in the, as they claim early on, it's really in the neurosis on the couch. That's really what they see as the stultifying moment. That we've reached an impasse. We're at the, we really are at the end of a kind of, dominance of, the Hegelian version of history, that somehow the end will happen, right? And the world spirit is, has made this journey, with all peace, all due respect to Francis Fukuyama, the end of history. I don't think that's the way some people read, and Marx, in a way, there's a very non-teleological reading of Marx too, that, which is Althusserian and others who don't see Marx as saying that this is going to be the end of history, only that this eschatological and, visions of history are not playing out. So in some ways, again, I want us to, I think we're going to get more out of this. He did take it back, Matt. Thank you for putting that in the chat, that Fukuyama took it back in his latest, later work. So, and anyway, he wrote the piece for, as David was mentioning, the Bush years. He wrote the New American Project for the New American Century. He was part of that in the early phases of the late George H. Bush regime, right? So to speak. But anyway, I think, again, we're going to do ourselves more of a service and learn more here. This is just me speaking as a kind of facilitator and a reader of this, that if we look at this through what the critical moment is, how this critical scaffolding is going, how they're going about it, and that the liberating part may be, and I'm not sure about this, again, I don't want to glorify schizoid analysis or the way of celebrating schizophrenia, but in a certain way, they see the product where capitalism leads, and really ultimately what's demonstrated, to use your language, in this totalizing way, it leads to a kind of the schizoid subject, right? In the end, right? It is not more than the divided self, more than the split subject that you very eloquently last week described in Freud, the Spaltung and the splitting of the ego. Much more than that, they see this as the symptom of our times. This is 72, as you know, right, in a sense. And if you read culture from 50 years ago, if you really look at this, over the last 48 years, if you will, since this book was published, and all this stuff is kind of hitting us in a way, you begin to see these symptoms throughout society in a way. The law and order that came back, the repression that came back, the counter-revolutionary forces, all of these things, played out. And this is the result we have today, right? In many ways, we don't have a really liberated zones, etc. In fact, we don't really have the joyfulness that, they kind of, are trying to speak to, right? And which was in the air, maybe, in a sense. So, we have more of the, this kind of back to order, back to law, back to, the, repressive apparatuses of state control and state terror and these kind of things. So I'll return to this in a second. I see Josefa had her hand up, and then Carl and David too. Yeah. Josefa, please. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I was wondering if this also has a lot to do with the rebelling against structuralism of the that period, and basically, if you look at it through language, I think it was providing a system of interpretation, and so therefore Freud provides a system of interpretation, and let's say of codifying the unconscious. It seems, I mean, that's what I don't know much about psychology, but it seems that he's really going against this system, and that's why the machine is against system. So the machine is basically a flow or something that is codified by Freud or by the family, and so so I was wondering if how does this connect with Marx? And I know it's in terms of production, desire and production, right? I mean, that's what the Marxist element is, if I'm right? So how does it?
It's one of many Marxist elements. I think Chris was very good earlier in saying that this is the Grundrisse in a way. It's a long commentary, if you will, on the sections, the fragment of machines. That's certainly one way to read this text in terms of deterritorialization and reterritorialization and what's happening in the system, and that somewhat, and I don't want to be reductive here, but in a way, they're looking at a kind of bourgeoisification of psychoanalysis and a retreat of psychoanalysis from the streets. This one thing about Guattari that I admire deeply is he brings psychoanalysis to the streets. This is a real moment in French theory. It's and in French practice, where this is out on the streets. This is not being hidden just to the dominant bourgeoisie or a kind of club. This is something that is really part of a radical practice in the society at large, right? So, and going back to what you say about structuralism, yes, it is a kind of an attempt to get away from Saussurean linguistics, right? It's Gemselfian, and again, I'm very sorry, I need to brush up on that, but I don't have the book with me, the Prolegomena to a Theory of Language that Louis Gemself wrote, which is very important for Deleuze, as is Charles Peirce, again on language, as is the Stoics on language in Logique de Sens. So this is also playing out with different, influences, if you will, on Deleuze. And so, yes, there is this attack on structuralism, and in many ways, that's going on through the linguistics. But again, I think that the interesting thing here about the Marx is that they understand the relationship of Freud. This goes on later in the book, and that's why I'm asking us to give it. I mean, we give it a chance. I'm not saying we have to buy it. That's another thing. I think we have a lot to learn here in terms of connections. That's all. That's all I'm saying in terms of a flow book. I'm not saying we have to become, schizoids or schizoid analysts or the new schizoid culture, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing is there are many interesting moments here that can be really worked. The relationship of Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, to Freud and to Freudian psychoanalysis that goes on later in the text. Right now, it's scaffolding that's going on. It's a scaffolding. If you want to look at this, that they're really trying to undo these bricks, right? They choose 3 texts of Freud that they think are crucial. The paranoiac, right? As David again very much showed in the economic problem of masochism, a child is being beaten, and of course, analysis, terminal and interminal, the ongoing narration. Too many words, right? and then through the sessions, what they can take from psychoanalysis. I think they're very fair at some levels. I don't think they're just heavy-handed. We're going to dismiss this or dismiss that. I think they're trying to work through something here in a very productive way, and I hope we can continue with this at that level. And going back to Marx, this in a way is an attempt towards a Marxist materialist theory of what psychiatry could be, outside the idealist predications of Oedipus, re-Oedipalization, etc. Yeah, and they want to get out of that language, of Oedipus, and again the anti-Oedipal Oedipal nature. Yeah. So go ahead, Carl. I'm sorry. I can, again, these questions are all the stuff dissertations and more are made up. So I'm sorry.
David, did you have your hand up first, or
the what? I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
so,
yeah, David, yeah, sure. Okay, whatever. Yeah.
In terms of, to respond to what David said, it's interesting how I sometimes have the reaction reading this of it's almost like an exuberance. It's like this liberation that we're just going to be these decentered, fluid, desiring machines, unbound by the ethical, territorialization.
Right.
I also hear what you're saying, and I think this to me is like kind of critical. Is do they really pose a way out? Because those parts, going back to like page 32, 33, where they actually talk about capitalism is constantly deterritorializing. The capital is almost in the form of the schizo, that it recognizes no limits, no barriers, everything, all this and. It's neither, it's, and then these territorializing moments come in, but they're constantly being burst apart. And it seems like we see that, right? Like the nation state is undermined by that's one interpretation of globalization. So I just, that resonated with me. The one other thing I just wanted to sort of throw in here as another theme is the relation to Hegel and Marx. And I think that they're leaving out a huge part of Marx, which is Marx's theory of social form. And Marx is very explicit throughout all his work, in the Grundrisse, where he talks about his methodology, and throughout all the volumes of Capital, everything, that he's talking about a totality.
Right.
And I think that, I remember Frederick Jameson used this term, the expressive totality, that it's revealed.
Well, actually, I'm sorry. I'm just going to clarify on that. That's Louis Althusser's term that he takes up, that he distinguishes from the structural totality, and that Hegel is the greatest expression of the expressive totality.
Yes.
Okay.
So it will be interesting again to see where they go with this, because it's sort of the Hegel of logic that Marx cites. He says, when I was writing Capital, I went back to logic, and you see those. I'm not saying Marx is a Hegelian, but I do believe that there is very much that Capital is a totality. He starts from the part, the cell, works up to the totality, and then back down through all its mediations. And I think that that's a very different approach than kind of what they're talking about of this sort of decentered desiring production, which seems more Bergsonian, or to come from a very different place. So I just think that's another.
I'm going to hold that, because that's again another long. We'll get there, and I hear the influence of books. So let me go to David and Winters too. Yeah, he's had his hand up for a while. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. I'll be pretty quick. Just to recapitulate a couple things that I was thinking.
Sure.
So the moment, I think it's like fun or useful to remember that the moment that they're writing in, and what makes this book so relevant to our moment, though it's 40, 50 odd years later, is that the questions that they're raising still haven't been answered, right? And are still the questions that are repeatedly raised by left social theory, although the answers there's a variety of them. Like the lack of a real concrete answer is kind of what Marx left social theory, like from this period, I think, to the present day. That there is no concrete emancipatory subject to sort of like theorize for. So the question is like, where might this emerge? How might we rethink where we thought this kind of emergence would happen in the first place? So like Hegel, Marx, and Freud all need to be dealt with, because the state formation has to be dealt with. The class formation that's mediated by a party formation has to be dealt with. And Oedipus has to be dealt with, because none of these things have led to an emancipatory like movement that was able to succeed without doubling back on itself, right, even if it had a moment of like possibility. So like, as they sit down to write this book, that's what has to be dealt with, right? Is like, why has this way of thinking that resolves in the state, in the party, or on the couch led not to emancipation, but to this, right?
Yes, we asked that question.
Yeah, and the reason that this is still so relevant and why Lazzarato is still using it to such great effect in all of his new books and all that is because, like, do you have an answer to those questions, everybody? You know, like what is, without the state, without the party, without psychologizing it, like how do we get outside of the society of control that we're within right now while trying to think our way out of it? Mm-hmm. And so like we're still trying to think our way out of it in a way that we can make concrete and like, you know, obviously we're trying to work from social movements that give us something to think about in the first place, and then ask how can we think like the new based on how Black Lives Matter is organizing, or how like whatever is organizing. Mm-hmm. But we're still in those questions and so we're still trying to figure out, like we're still looking at, this is the last thing I'll say, in the police media stuff and like the end of policing stuff that I study, it's the same thing, right? Like the really good stuff, like even Alex Vitale's stuff, the really good stuff still ends with like questions of the state, the party, or in a way, Oedipus, right? Like how do we fix this from a governmental standpoint? How do we develop a new political party through social movements? Or like how do we correct the development of the police in their psychology so that they don't get so abusive or whatever? Yeah. So we're still, and even the best of us are still like not out of the state and the party and like you know, the sort of edible re-education as like answers to these questions.
Friend of mine, and yes, he's still in the edible moment in many ways. Yes, I understand. Yeah, very well. Yeah, we did a show with him, by the way, recently on the end of policing and etc. But yeah, no, good points, David. And I think you're absolutely right. It's still extremely relevant today. And the question of agency, you know, what really is needed to be done here, you know, all of these things are very, very crucial as we go forward. Okay, Bruno, you've been silent tonight. Yeah.
No, first of all, I finally found out how to raise my hand digitally. But
good. Okay. Yeah.
No, I wanted to say that.
You're off the couch. You're off the couch. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So, but in relation to many of the things being said already, but the sections we were reading for today, some concepts that I found very important that I hope that we can talk a little about them, are those of beginning, then also the beyond and the afterward. That seems to me that all this inscribes whatever they're saying precisely in and within the plane of immanence that we know is so important for them. So, and it seems that, you know, they deny the fact that there is a beginning, of course, and that there is therefore a beyond, the after Oedipus and so on, which, by the way, also, you know, reminds me, I mean, an association can be made to Marx, Marx's famous chapter right at the end of Capital One, on the original accumulation that goes back, of course, it's a critique as well as Smith, right? And so there isn't such a thing. So it is within the immanence that the mutation, the existential mutation, the transformation that Lazzarato also highlights, speaking about Guattari in Science and Machines, takes place. Yes. So it is the flow that you have very often mentioned, right? I mean, it is there that so the Oedipus, the Oedipus thing, and so on. That is precisely, as they say at one point, an ideological construct, right? So, but there is no such a thing as
an
a
ideological form, they say.
Form, okay, maybe
ideological form, which is very interesting.
Okay.
It is of ideological form, right?
Right.
They go from myth, through complex to actually it becomes an ideological form.
Yeah, and if I may say one last thing,
very
Michael,
way of looking at psychoanalysis. Yeah. I'm sorry, yeah.
And one last thing that I found this very, interesting and puzzling in a sense when they speak about the inductors and the inducer on page 92, and they say the true organizer is elsewhere. I mean, still speaking from within the plane of immanence, the organizer, when they criticize the idea that the parents are the inductors and so on, but what counts is the inducing itself, the process of inducing something. And again, this shows once again that there is no beginning after which there is a beyond. There is no such a traditionally metaphysical separation between a beginning and then whatever happens after, right? So that it is the constant flow and the process itself, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
In the beginning was the process or the flow. The famous story in Faust when Faust is translating the Bible. In the beginning was the word, he scratches that out. In the beginning was the spirit, he crosses that out. Then he gets to in the beginning was, what was the other one? The force, Kraft. He crosses that out. Then he gets to the final. In the beginning was the deed, praxis, right? For Guattari and Deleuze, it's not structural linguistics or the word of the unconscious that becomes used. It's not the spirit, right? The world spirit at work here. It's not only the play of forces, although force is very important. It's really in the beginning is the process, right? In the beginning is, again, look, I mean, the triad, to go back to Hegel for a second, that really plays out here is desire, nature, and society. They add to nature and society, which is an ecological dualism in a way of thinking, they add desire to the equation. It's desire, nature, and society. And they're very interested. The schizoid is the example of homo natura. They repeat this constantly. Yeah, right? Constantly.
Yeah.
Yeah, in a way, right?
Very
important. Yeah, please, Bruno. And
no, it is also
contextualize what you were reading, though, because it has a context. It's a very interesting context.
Which one? Yeah,
the one on page 92.
Maybe we should go there also. Yeah. But because it is this constant mutation, when they mention who's the guy, I can't remember the name now, the dance, the Ukrainian dance. That just like Artaud writes about his own experience in his autobiography.
Nijinsky.
Yes. And I mean, the constant mutation of...
Great dancer, by the way.
Huh?
He was a great dancer.
Yeah. Then I checked, yes.
Yeah.
But it's, I mean, really this, the constant transformation of whatever is, I mean, we can also think in terms of whatever is understood as the I, the self, and so on and so forth. I mean, that constantly mutates and becomes the other. No, it's this constant passage. And the idea of the threshold is very often present as well, right? That there is always crossing of a threshold into something which is not the other, just like in that. Again, we received they mentioned the. I can't find it now, but.
Well, I mean, again, you point to a very good section. I just want to make everybody aware the history of Oedipus kind of follows up on the holy familialism, and again, what they're scaffolding here. The history of Oedipus, the parental figures are in no way organizers, but they're rather inductors or stimuli of varying vague import that trigger processes of an entirely different nature, processes that are endowed with what amounts to an indifference with regard to the stimulus. Doubtless one can believe that in the beginning, the stimulus, the Oedipal inductor, is a real organizer, but believing is an operation of a conscious or preconscious nature, an extrinsic perception rather than an operation of the unconscious upon itself, right? From the beginning of the life of the child, it is already an altogether different undertaking that pierces the mask of Oedipus, a different flow running through the openings in the mask, a different adventure, that of desiring production. Yet it cannot be said that psychoanalysis was unaware of this in a certain respect. In his theory of the primal fantasy, or the traces of archaic hereditary and the endogenous sources of all the superego, Freud constantly asserts that the active factors are not the real parents and not even the parents as the child imagines them. Such is also the case, and all the more so for Lacan's disciples. This is very important, this section, where they take up the distinction between the imaginary and the symbolic, where they oppose the name of the father to the imago, right? And the foreclosure concerning the signifier to a real deficiency or absence of the parental personage. There's no better example than this to show that the parental figures, are in different inductors, which you were saying, Bruno, and that the true organizer is elsewhere, outside, elsewhere, right? And on the side of what is induced, not on that of the inductor. Very important, this section here again, for our understanding of the
very important. And if you don't,
the beginning of the question, and
yeah,
what is the question? The same question, right? As is in the case of the biological egg, and they go through this analogically to the biological age, right? There we have the incurable familialism of psychoanalysis. Again, the scaffolding is going on. I don't think it's just a disavowal or a denial. I think they're taking the best of the tradition in some ways and trying to think beyond it in terms of becoming and processes. If you want to rewrite terminal and interminal analysis, as you're always still in becoming, right?
Yeah.
You're still, when you leave, you're still actively becoming, right?
If I may add, sorry, Michael, but if we can link this back to this great sentence, short sentence on page 87, like it's line 2, 3, maybe 10 from the top, where they say the schizo has no principles.
Right.
So no principle of individuation, even we can say, right?
Principles.
Right. He's something only by being something else.
Right.
So that's the true organizer is somewhere else. That's the idea, almost like Arturo Rimbaud. I is another, not I am another. I is another.
Right. Exactly.
Right. So that's basically the idea of this becoming, that as they say, becoming whatever, not becoming woman and so on and so forth, in Thousand Plateau as well. And the idea, therefore, that the inducing process itself is what counts, right? I mean, this becoming, constant becoming other, right? And I mean, I thought that was important too, this link to be made between that section, page 92, and this idea of the being, always being elsewhere.
Right.
Which is, by the way, I mean, because if one thinks of this in terms also of immanence, it's really interesting. What is this elsewhere? What is it really? It's an interesting question in itself, right? But
yes, and also in another place.
No, because if I may, I mean, there is something great also later. They say, usually very often, there is the question of, say, even philosophically, whether it's a metaphor or a concept, the idea of homelessness, of being away and not being able to go back home and so on. But here, at one point, we find that the tragedy of the schizo, precisely, the schizophrenic, is to be brought back home.
Right.
To be brought back to the place that one has left. And then there
Odysseus, the postmodern Odysseus in some ways. It's interesting. As I think Richard's still there. He said the schizoid ship of fools, right? Yeah, in a way, in a sense, bring the ship back, right, home, right. This is
right, and force
another kind of odyssey. I'm gonna let Carl speak, but I just want to make one comment apropos David, and I'm thinking of the analogical schools of reading. This actually does a commentary on Schreber, page 89. It's also a commentary of the Schreber case in Paranoia. Yeah. That they go through of the first text of Freud that they were. So this happens on 89, 90 as they build to this again. Yeah. Okay, Carl, please. Yeah.
Oh, this is just building off of this same section. I just wanted to share something. I've given myself a little bit of a crash course in Freud the last couple of weeks, so I have this reference readily available. It's out of the ego and the id, and what I sort of was reading them is, this phylogenetic aspect of what triggers development and then how the development takes place.
Right.
And they talk about the is it innateness of preformation or something, is there this preformation in Oedipus? And Freud says, this isn't too long. The experiences of the ego seem at first to be lost for inheritance, saying that it doesn't seem to be what we inherit, right? But when they've been repeated often enough and with sufficient strength in many individuals in successive generations, they transform themselves, so to say, into experiences of the id, the impressions of which are preserved by heredity. Thus, in the id, which is capable of being inherited, are borrowed residues of the existence of countless egos.
Mm-hmm.
And when the ego forms its superego out of the id, it may perhaps only be reviving shapes of former egos and bringing them into resurrection. That's kind of a pretty stunning passage. I mean, just in itself. I mean, but I think that they're trying to undermine that. They're trying to say that there isn't we're not born Oedipal. Because that, I think, is in some sense almost how I read what Freud's saying, is that, this is kind of in us at this point. Like we're almost inheriting a deep structure that then is triggered and develops in a certain way that is kind of path determined. It's interesting. I just
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like a kind of original sin almost.
Go ahead, Bruno. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, like a kind of original sin that we are inheriting.
We're all like dealing with the original guilt of killing the father, and it's just you're born into this legacy, and that's just where you're at. I mean, that seems to be kind of the.
That's not at all, Carl, how I heard that passage. I would love to hear where it's from. I heard the flows and the group psychology that are coming out straight out of the id. I heard that is what's inherited in the socius.
I have it behind me. Do you have the page numbers from where you quoted, or?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I was reading Freud.
Yes, I understand the ego and the id. Yeah, I understand.
Not really. I have,
Not the straight sheet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So sorry. So it's
okay.
Yeah. No.
I'll find it and put it up on the. We can find it. And
I may be completely.
I know where it is. I just don't have. I don't want to run to the other room to get it. Richard, yes.
Talking about Oedipus, and he uses the term phylogenetic.
Right, phylogenetic and ontogenic. Yeah. This is a thing that Marcuse goes through very actively in Eros and Civilization too.
Yeah.
In the recapitulation. Yeah, the meta works are always dealing with that. Yeah, Richard, please. Yeah.
Well, I think Freud is always changing his ideas. I mean, he's famous for adding footnotes throughout his life. For example, on the 3 essays of sexuality. And there are some critical theorists such as Joan Kopchak who are, will point up that Freud really, in their mind, moves away from the Oedipus, into the idea of a primary repression and a secondary repression, and that so that the role, and I think this true is that, there's to my mind, there's an exaggeration of the importance of Oedipus in Freud, which in Deleuze and Guattari's work, which to me, to me, it's not, their work transcends, whether they got it right about Freud, their work completely transcends that because of, when there's no way you can deny the power of their work now in this time of machines and technology. But when I think about their relation to Freud, because they're also in a way, you always say about Aristophanes in the Frogs, that, he's taking the piss out of the tragedians, out of Euripides, Sophocles, and Aeschylus, but he had to fucking know them really well. It's kind of a interesting backhanded compliment. And, the work of Deleuze and Guattari, has a very interesting relation, particularly to Lacan. But so, I think is that psychoanalysis has changed, as David kind of pointed out, from today, from that time. The other thing about Oedipus is, one of the things Freud says in the interpretation of dreams is people say about psychoanalysis, they say, oh, well, let sleeping dogs lie. And, Freud thinks was, well, if they're asleep, great. But they're very often not asleep. And, the same thing is with, I think today at least, the analysts I know, are not particularly interested in Oedipus. In fact, I know more Lacanian analysts than non-Lacanian, but, the family is really not their primary interest. They're really, I think, more the American analysts, but I can't speak, I don't know enough, but they, there's a bit more kind of circular focus on the family, but, generally I would say that analysis that's not where analysis is. But I think in terms of machines and technology, there's a great affinity. And the other thing is, so that in the time of Freud, his work shifted, and people like Kopchak, who's a Lacanian, will emphasize, and Lacan, his writing, thought that Freud ridiculed Freud's focus on Oedipus. He kind of thought it was Freud's own neuroses. He kind of thought, so his work is already kind of further diminishing the importance, but it's so important to Deleuze and Guattari. One is, again, Bloom's anxiety of influence. It's a way of making, it makes him into a figure that they can move against or criticize against in a way that's very creative, regardless. That's why you can't really, I think you miss the point if you go and just pick apart their criticisms of Freud, because their work is of much greater importance than that. The other thing is that, Freud within his own time moved, constantly is re-theorizing. And, people like Kopchak will point out that as he moves to the notion of a primary repression and a secondary repression, the primary is really through language and castration. But for Lacan, castration is universal and is about the alienation that comes through language. And the way you kind of, you have to come to accept your own castration in us, all human beings. But, so Freud's work changed through time. And then is that in their time, and I think this is really important, and it's very easy to lose sight of, is in their time, psychiatry was primarily psychoanalysis, and it was primarily American psychoanalysis. When it's so different than today, but the paradigm of psychiatry being pushed around the world in the 60s. I mean, there were starting to be other movements, but it comes out of the dominance of the American psychiatric, psychoanalytic movement after the Second World War. And it's that which is particularly Oedipalized. And that's the great American, in their time, psychoanalysis, American psychoanalysis was, in the post-war period, was the napalm. I mean, it was the empire. And now it's easy because things have changed so differently. Psychiatry certainly has moved, totally abandons psychoanalysis at a particular point, not too much after this, or around this time, in fact. So it's a moving, there's a whole, talking about flows, there's the fluidity of Freud's work, there's the fluidity of what psychiatry is, and there's the fluidity of what psychoanalysis is, and all of that plays into their reading of Freud's work, and yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. Good point. Anybody else? Some questions or remarks on the on what's on the table? I mean, yes. There's no question that the Americanization of psychoanalysis was a disaster in post-World War II. It led to, maybe their use of the notion of imperial Oedipus and imperial holy familialism. And remember, too, that the neoconservative revolution was built on one level on family values, the return of the family.
Right.
Remember this very actively, and we have a kind of nepotism that's working everywhere now, even on the left, right? Which should have been against nepotism. But, this kind of nepotism that has come back, and the haunting thing. And of course, Donald Trump is again, a result of that kind of familianism and nepotism that shows its ugly face and really what this is about at a certain level. So in a way, I'm not so sure we have, actually killed the father too. That's another thing, right? Or that image, if you will, or the ideological form that they call Oedipus. I like this language of the ideological form called Oedipus. I think this
I think it's
very rich, in terms of our purposes. Yeah, go ahead, Richard. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, I just say, even in the film I just did, which is about, where Lacan is analyzing this woman who comes to him. I mean, the point is, the success for her is to leave the father behind. I mean, that's kind of what the story of her analysis is that she's unconsciously stuck on her father, whom she's totally forgotten about. The story, right? She's like, my father. And, and by the end, she's able to move beyond her father and get on with her life. So that's just to agree with you that, there are these kind of structures, people do, but I don't, but, there's a way in which some forms of analysis seem to reproduce their own business model almost. They kind of, Oedipalization is in a way like saying, you keep using the credit card. In other words, it just is a constant circle it produces more need for more analysis.
You need to add that to this book. See, that's a good extension of this book. Oedipalization and keep putting up the credit card. That's very good. I like that. That's in the vein of Felix and Gilles.
And the only other thing I was going to say is, it was a disaster, but it was also a really successful disaster. I mean, it was, again, it was like, there were TV talk show hosts. In Forbidden Planet, the monster turns out to be the id of the doctor. I mean, it just was, and, I think as they mentioned, Hollywood just falls in love with psychoanalysis, you know.
Yeah.
And so they really go hog wild.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Yeah. So some other. I was just going to mention. You know, we haven't really spoken to this yet in a more profound way. It's interesting that their use of Lang, you know, and the divided self and others is another aspect here. Remember, this is also a period, you know, as Richard pointed out, this Americanization of psychoanalysis and the dominance of ego psychology and adaptive and, you know, the culturalist school, the Harry Stack Sullivan schools, all of these things which Sullivanians turned into be a disaster with the fourth wall here in New York. You know, we have all kinds of, you know, problems around that area. But, you know, the cultural moment and, you know, this kind of adaptation and assimilationist model that psychoanalysis worked with, especially in Karen Horney's account, neurosis and human growth, and everything became, again, individualized without the social, without the effect of the socius. But anyway, the other aspect of this was a period of great experimentation. And you have Tavistock Clinic, you know, after Anna Freud got over the spankings, you know, she was the founder of Tavistock Clinic in London, and you know, the Russell Station in London is Tavistock Clinic, and you know, Lang was there with experiments, and it was Tavistock Publications who actually published, you know, going back to the Stanford, it was a different time. They published Foucault's History of Madness, Madness and Civilization. Was Tavistock was the first to do this. But anyway, on page, you know, going back to this notion of flux and becoming, it seems to say they be very, very interesting here about on pages 94 and 95. I think this is a very good place to look at. This is on foreclosure in psychoanalysis. So again, they still are after Oedipus, right? In a sense, they still see foreclosure bound to Oedipus. But I like the way this is, you know, developing in terms of, yeah, Oedipus is a ideological form, etc. So anyway, but even within the progressive or revolutionary sectors of institutional analysis on the one hand, and anti-psychiatry on the other, this is the bottom of 95. The danger of this familialism in extension is ever present, conforming to the double impasse of an extended Oedipus. Just as much in the diagnostic or pathogenic families in themselves as in the constitution of therapeutic quasi-families. Once it has been said that it is no longer a matter of reforming cadres. So speaking about, these are militants, really, to be honest. I mean, they really are. Of familial and social adaptation or integration, but rather of instituting original forms of active groups. The question arises as to what extent these core groups resemble, artificial families, and to what extent have they lent themselves to Oedipalization. So again, they're trying to build a new group of agents, if you will. This is another thing that's going on here, a new cadre. So Eloy, this is a part of the political impetus of this book. How do you bring cadres that are not going to be re-Oedipalized into the system, can be adapted? You know, don't recognize the police when they see it. They have a level here. You have to read this again in multi-layers in a sense. So these questions have been analyzed in depth by Jean Ouret, who was the director of the Laborde Clinic. They demonstrate how revolutionary psychiatry broke in vain with the ideals of community adaptation, with everything that Maud Manoni calls the adaptation police force. Nice phrase, right? To think about Alex, David's still here, about Alex Vitale in a way, you know, the adaptation police force, with all due respect to my friend Alex, anyway, since at every moment it still risks being thrust back into the framework of a structural Oedipus whose deficiencies are diagnosed, but whose integrity is restored. A holy trinity that continues to strangle desiring production and suffocate its problems. The political, cultural, world historical, and racial content is left behind, crushed in the Oedipal treadmill. Again, the scaffolding that's going on of the dominance of American, but to another degree, French traditional psychoanalysis, and to a degree, some of the structural psychoanalysis. This is because psychiatrists persist in treating the family as a matrix, right? Or better still, as a microcosm, an expressive milieu that, and they use in italicized, an expressive milieu that provides its own justifications, and that, however capable of expressing the action of the alienating force, mediates them precisely by suppressing the true categories of production in the machines of desire. So they're really looking at it. It seems to us that such a viewpoint is present even in David Cooper, who was Lang's thinker and collaborator. In this respect, Lang is better able to disentangle himself or disengage himself from familialism, thanks to a resource of a flux from the Orient, which is interesting, right? Cooper writes, families mediate social reality to their children. If the social reality in question is rife with alienated social forms, then this alienation will be mediated to the individual child, which we experienced as estrangement in the family relationships. For example, he may say that his mind is controlled by an electrical machine or by men from outer space. These constructions, however, are largely embodiments of the family processes which have the illusion of substantiality, but which is none other than the alienated form of the action of praxis of the family members that literally dominates the mind of the psychotic member. These metaphysical men from outer space are literal mother, father, and sibling who sit around the breakfast table with the so-called psychotic patient. So he's looking at they're looking at clinical studies of Tavistock. This is a quote from Cooper that they're looking at in terms of this microcosm, macrocosm. Even the essential hypothesis of anti-psychiatry, of which Cooper was one of the leading people, of which Guattari, in another incarnation, going back to Justin, was one of the founding members of, with Radio Alicia, right, in Italy, with Basaglia and others, of which Lazzarato emerges out of, and many other people, and that actually were running guns to revolutionary movements all over Africa as well as other places. But yeah. Anyway, that's another story. Even the essential, which ultimately posits an identity in nature between social alienation and mental alienation, must be understood in terms of a maintained familialism and not in terms of a refutation of this familialism. Remember, they're really trying to get away here, as Richard was saying, today, nobody really talks about the family anymore, right? Even though it's ever present in the neocon movement, right? It's not, but again, it's not really the familialism, even though I think it's returned. It certainly is returned in my Greek heritage. I hear all kinds of stuff. Why don't you come to New Orleans? What's the matter with you? And they said, anyway, for it is to this extent that the family microcosm, the family-social indicator, expresses social alienation, that it is believed to organize mental alienation in the mind of its own members or its psychotic member. And among all the members, who is the real psychotic? And I don't know if any of you read The Politics of the Family by Lang, but a lot of these issues are brought up by Lang, who was a radical in his time. He didn't end up staying a radical, but he actually had a great moment. With his general conception of microcosm, macrocosm, and going back to where Carl was saying there's a Bergsonianism, this is Deleuze speaking, because Deleuze was a very active reader of Bergson, especially Matter and Memory, and the works on cinema, right? Bergson brought about a discrete revolution that deserves further consideration. Likening the living to a microcosm is an ancient platitude. But if the living organism was thought to be similar to the world, that was attributed to the fact that it was tended to be an isolated system, naturally closed. The comparison between microcosm and macrocosm was thus a comparison between two closed figures. Interesting, right? One of which expressed the other when inscribed within the other. At the beginning of creative evolution, Bergson completely alters the scope of the comparison by opening up both ends. If the living being resembles the world, this is true on the contrary, insofar as it opens itself to the opening of the world. If it is a whole, this is true to the extent that the whole of the world, as of the living being, is always in the process of becoming, developing, coming into being or advancing, and inscribing itself within a temporal dimension which is irreducible and non-closed. We believe that this is also true in the case of the family-society relationship. There is no Oedipal triangle, right? Oedipus is always open in an open social field. Oedipus opens to the four winds, to the four corners of the social field, not even 3 plus 1, but 4 plus n. 4 plus n. A purely closed triangle, a porous or seeping triangle, and this is interesting, the way they start looking at the geometry, if you will, of holy familialism. This is very interesting, in terms of how they look at the new topography, if you will, new points of locality, okay, in which, an exploded triangle from which the flows of desire and escape in the direction of other territories. It is strange we had to wait for the dreams, and this is very interesting to me, that we had to wait for the dreams of colonized people in order to see that on the vertices of the pseudo triangle, mommy was dancing with the missionary. Daddy was being fucked by the tax collector, while the self was being beaten by the white man. By a white man. It is precisely this pairing of the parental figures with agents of another nature, their locking embrace similar to that of wrestlers, that keeps this the triangle from closing up again, from being valid in itself, for claiming to express or represent this different nature of the agents that are in question in the unconscious itself. This is really, sophisticated. When you really begin to think about how far they really went with this. When Frantz Fanon encounters a case of persecution psychosis linked to the death of the mother, he first asks himself what if he has to deal with an unconscious guilt complex following on the death of the mother, as Freud described in Mourning and Melancholia. But he soon learns that the mother has been killed by a French soldier, and that the subject himself has murdered the wife of a colonist whose disemboweled ghost perpetually appears before him, carrying along with it and tearing apart the memory of his mother. It could also be said that these extreme situations of war trauma, right, of colonization, of dire poverty, and so on, are unfavorable to the construction of the Oedipus apparatus. And that it is precisely because of this and these situations favor a psychotic development or explosion, but we have a strong feeling that the problem lies elsewhere. Apart from the fact that a certain degree of comfort found in the bourgeois family is admittedly necessary to turn out Oedipalized subjects, the question of knowing what is actually invested, this is important too, what is actually invested in the comfortable conditions of a supposedly normal or normative Oedipus is pushed still further into the background. The revolutionary is the first to have the right to say Oedipus, ? Never heard of it. For the disjointed fragments of Oedipus remains stock to all the corners of the historical social field as a battlefield and not a scene from the bourgeois theater. Right? Too bad if the psychoanalysis roar their disapproval at this point. Fanon pointed out that troubled times had unconscious effects not only on the active militants, but also on those claiming to be neutral and to remain outside the affair, uninvolved in politics. The same could be said in respect to apparently peaceful times. What a grotesque error to think that the unconscious as child is acquainted only with daddy, mommy, and it doesn't know in its own way that its father has a boss who is not a father's father, or moreover, right, that its father himself is a boss who is not a father. Therefore, we formulate the following rule, which is we feel to be applicable in all cases. The father and mother only exist as fragments. And I think both you, David, and Richard were saying this about Freud's revision in a way, if we continue to look at Oedipus as an ideological form, if we want to look at it that way, vis-a-vis Fanon and some of the excellent work that came out of the decolonization period. And we never use, and we are never organized into a figure or a structure, right, able both to represent the unconscious and to represent it in the various agents of the collectivity. Rather, they always shatter into fragments that come into contact with these agents, meet them face to face, square off with them, and settle the differences with them as in hand-to-hand combat. I think this is very interesting in terms of reading this book again as, the beginning of a kind of, process of decolonization, right, of the Western, domination of the imperial, Oedipus, if you will, or of, imperialism, to use an older language, or empire in some ways. And they're really into this in the sense why they want to go against the hermeneutical interpretations, of course, the dominant structural interpretations, and they want to move this into, look, there's something different happening here. Will it come in the figure of Mao Zedong? Will it come in the figure of Patrice Lumumba? What is entering the unconscious at this point, and how do we deal with this outside, right? The couch, etc. So this is, I think, where they're coming from at another level, right? I want to say this. It's not only the dismantling of the psychoanalytical apparatus, or, the quote, anti-Oedipal moment here. It's also a massive displacement to think about this in a very different way of building a materialist psychiatry, right? In a way, yeah. So I think this is very important. Yeah.
And I wonder if other people also saw. It seems like the family in this chapter, and then there's the section that follows this where they talk about social repression and psychic repression.
Yeah, and that's Reich, by the way.
Yeah, and it's
their attempt to go to Reich.
That there's a little bit of a contradiction, or they want to have their cake and eat it too, maybe, is that they want to sort of displace the family. I mean, I really like, there is no Oedipal triangle. Oedipus is always open social field. But then they also talk about the family as kind of the agent of social repression, even though they've displaced Oedipus. But it seems like they're kind of, in a certain way, reintroducing the family in a different way, perhaps. But that the family, then they do say that it's kind of the critical agent through which social repression is enacted onto subjects. And at least I read it that. I mean, I think it's page in my book 119 and 120, where they're talking about Reich, and very much how the family is the agent of this.
But why would that contradict? Because I mean, they seem to be saying this throughout, that the holy familialism itself is the delegated agent of psychic repression. Right? I mean, that's how it happens. Or rather, the agent delegated to psychic repression, the incestuous drives, are the disfigured image of the repressed. The Oedipus complex, the process of Oedipalization, is therefore the result of this double operation. It is in one and the same movement that the repressive social production is replaced by the repressing family, and that the latter offers a displaced image of desiring production that represents the repressed as incestuous familial drives. In this way, the family drives relationship is substituted for the relation to the two orders of production in a diversion where the whole of psychoanalysis goes astray.
Michael?
Yeah.
I was just going to say also is interesting is that Fanon will become one of the major theoretical founding theorists for the Black Panthers, and during this period, of course, you have the rebellion in Detroit, which is referred to often as the riots.
Right.
And what does Moynihan say? They say the problem is the family.
Yes.
The Black family has been. So, there you have an exact example of where you know, the great think tanks of the American government.
Yeah. He was sipping on a lot of stuff in that great think tank. I'm sorry. Yeah.
And they come out and say, the problem is we need to revitalize the family, patriarchal family.
Right, of course. And, you know, think about this too. The transition from welfare, the welfare state, and the end of the New Deal with Bill Clinton. Workfare. The problem is the family, the welfare queens that started with the Reagan analysis, you know, right. The Cadillacs in the ghetto. Think about all these kind of slogans that we get. Urban renewal meant urban removal, right? I mean, that's what the code is, right? Urban renewal meant urban removal of the Black family or of the Black culture. This was the problem, etc. The mama couldn't take care of the children, couldn't teach them the way that, you know, to go that way. And this is interesting. Carl, I'm sorry, I don't see the contradiction here. This is my lack, I guess, you know.
Yeah. But I don't want to over emphasize the point. I think it was really just more like to go back to the part you read where they're quoting Cooper, and you know this is back on page 95, I think.
Yeah.
And you know they start out with this quote. What Cooper says: "Families mediate social reality to their children."
Right.
And then you know Cooper goes a certain place with that, and I don't know.
They're arguing against Cooper.
Right, but
I don't think Cooper's radical enough that he's very mediated by the family. They're against mediation by the family.
But I don't think they really are, because
fair enough. Okay,
it seems to me that when they actually have to talk about the repressive mechanism, they do reintroduce the family as kind of the central agency. They actually talk about the family as an agent. That the family is the agent of, you know.
Where do you see that? I'm sorry. Certainly not an agent of revolution or revolutionary.
No, they talk about we would have to. Let's see.
Okay. I mean, I'll keep it in mind. Yes, of course, but
yeah, I don't want to, like, you know, again overemphasize it, but movement that the repressive social production is replaced by the repressing family, and that the latter offers a displaced image of desiring production. And then, you know, they go on to say that the family, that social production essentially needs the family as the agent that is also capable of acting on, of inscribing the recording surface of desire. And then they talk about the family is able to do this because it borrows from, I don't have the references immediately available, but it sort of borrows from the repressive nature of the body without organs, that it's able to kind of appropriate that. I thought this was interesting, and I guess, you know, when I was closer to like radical psychiatry and some of those, that seemed to be very much what people were saying, is that it's not to reassert the family as sort of the central aspect, but that the family is kind of the mediating agent. And it seems that they ultimately, in some way, reassert this. That's how I read it. Maybe that is a incorrect reading.
Well, I mean, I think they're also looking at this as the text I read from Fanon that they repeat, you know, in the sense, and that they do a commentary on, is a way of showing that the family means something very different, you know, in Algeria, Mozambique, you know, Martinique, etc., than it does in the bourgeois on the couch. So the holy familialism, the notion of the holy, is very much like in Marx, the Holy Family too. You know, when Marx uses these terms, I mean, they're playing on the language here. They're trying to destroy, if you will, bourgeois family. I mean, this is without any question in my mind, this is an antagonism here. Guattari had a very interesting thing about psychoanalysis, which is very radical notion that in some ways psychoanalysis reproduces the rotation of family capital. It's really based about inheritance of capital in a way, and how do you guard the bourgeoisie? How do you protect in some ways? And he was always had this thing about, look, I understand that someone's going to put more effort into the analytical situation if there's a cash nexus, of course. You don't give it away for free. But they were looking at this in terms of what it reinforces in terms of social reproduction and in the socius itself. So I don't think they have any truck with the bourgeois family, and they see the family as something very different in other parts of the world, in a sense. And I'm not going to use the phrase third worldism there, but North Africa, places that obviously they're in the French, the French areas. I mean, you've been to France, there's a Senegalese neighborhood, there's multiple North African communities that are happening there. Yeah.
Do you think R.D. Laing, though, would disagree with that passage on Fanon? It seems that, it seems like they're sort of drawing a certain contrast that I guess I just don't.
Yeah, I mean, I have to think about that. I mean, Laing was actually dealing with, again, a group of not the same population as, if you will, or not the same, group of, adolescents or patients or clinics that R.D. Laing was. Laing was at a highly experimental place called Tavistock. Fanon was working in clinics in France and in the colonies. Yeah, as well. So there's a very different interpretation. Yes, Joseph. Yeah, we'll go back to that. I think you raised good points, of course. Yeah.
I read a little bit about primitive.
Sorry.
I read a little bit. I went ahead and read a little bit about primitive societies. I think that's chapter 3.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the family there is. I think compared to the Oedipal, let's say, repression, so where you from the flow and you redirect it as a lack.
Right.
The family in the primitive society also served as a unit to codify social behavior, but instead of saying, of installing the Oedipal complex, they say, well, you need to marry someone from outside, so we can, we can connect with other societies, let's say.
Right.
So instead of, I guess the family has different roles. So it is a nucleus, but it's
right.
Family I guess it's a larger group. It's not just a nuclear family like in contemporary society.
Right. Oh, interesting. And we can go back to this. This is a very important thing. Again, this section is also a rereading of Levi-Strauss, right? In terms of Tristropique, as well as the works on the structural anthropology works that he did, and what struck. And for Levi-Strauss, Oedipus became universal. This is interesting that they have an argument with both for and against Levi-Strauss as well. They'll take up bricolage in one sense, which is a word he uses, and they'll use this actively throughout. And again, I think we if we only read for contradiction here, we're going to get in trouble in a sense. As Nietzsche says, great thinking always has contradictions in it, and maybe we should kind of go again with some of the flow here. But yeah, you raise a good point. I mean, this section on the savages, barbarians, and civilization is very interesting to me. This is where Marx and Freud come together, and colonization and decolonization are really coming together in this book. And also the founding of the state, the Urstaat. Very interesting how they go through this. So this is another interesting moment in all of this. Again, I mean, we're and we'll get to this, I guess, in about 3 weeks. The civilized capitalist machine, and we can inscribe Oedipus at that point and talk about Oedipus in a way. Fill it to the capital and alliance capital, to go back to what Guattari is arguing about in terms of the rotation of family capital. The transformation of surplus value of code into a surplus value of flux we're going to speak about this as well. So you begin to see the Marxist language come in, the Marx of capital, right? Not so much the humanistic Marx, the Marx of Grundrisse and forward. And again, I think, is Chris still here? I mean, a very insightful remark. At one level, this book is not only a long dismantling in the beginning of Oedipus, right? And the Oedipus as an ideological form and how it plays out. And I really appreciate all these other readings of Freud. And, to me, Freud was one of the absolute modern masters, and, was both humble and arrogant enough to always revise and, make different things happen. But at the same time, this is also a book that's a long commentary, as Richard said, very prescient for our days, about the relationship to the machines, right? Where are we with the machines today? What does this mean? This generation that kind of came out of this book too. So a lot of us here are, products of the 60s or maybe some of the 70s, but and maybe even, anyway, whatever. So the idea is, look, there's much more happening here. Yeah, Richard. Yeah.
And I would say also the machine, also cinema.
Cinema. Of course.
The way they're putting, and the way we live in the world of images, moving images, everywhere. So their work also is very foresighted in terms of the role of images, moving images, in constructing, producing a subject. Producing. So they're really. Their antennae are quite impressive.
Oh yeah, they're up there. They're on another. Yeah. They're way further out than Elon Musk in some ways.
Yeah.
With their feet on the ground. Yeah. So I mean, I think David, or Rocky. We haven't heard from you, please. Yeah. You have to unmute though.
Well, Michael, each generation also, that crying baby sends dad out the door. And each generation provides another generation of undereducated workers.
Yes, that's true. Absolutely. No, these were educated workers during this period. And
yes.
I mean, I want to say this to some of the younger people. There were workers that were, I mean, I know Eloy knows this in Mexico, that there are people who teach or executed by the state. But during this period, Pierre Ouvrenier, who was the Renault factory worker who had study groups in Marx, was assassinated, cold blood.
Of course.
Yeah. So, and you had many people like this. Jean-Paul Sartre's apartment was bombed because of his support of Ouvrenier. There are many, many levels to this that, we don't see, and, I mean, they're not reporting on here at all.
Right, and there's always the availability of the prison.
Sorry?
And there's always the availability of the prison.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, no, very, very true. Yeah. I mean, I just finished watching. The performance is good. The movie's kind of, it's sexist, but, it's part of the period. Jacques Mézerin, the great bank robber in Montreal. He was in Montreal. He escaped twice from Laval prison, Eloy, Mézerin, and he ended up in Paris, and he actually became a good friend of Guy Debord. And, in fact, his when he went to prison, his daughter and son were raised by Gilles Lipovetsky, the good friend of Debord, who was murdered too. Yeah, so there's very interesting stuff going on with the prisons during this period. And remember, Jean Genet was smuggled from Canada into the United States to be at the New Haven trials. We had many moments here of which this book is very interestingly situated, both as foresighted, as Richard points out, and Chris Knight did earlier, about a commentary on the Grundrisse and the section, the fragment on machines, and how much it anticipates, but also in the moment. Think about it in the moment as well, in a way, what's going on. Okay, so Jeff, I think you had your hand up. Yeah,
I think I don't know if you felt like we sort of worked this aspect over in previous weeks, but where I'm starting to return to, like, repeatedly, is just the concept of production in this context, in the context of this book. I think that's a sort, maybe in Freud is sort of a new concept, but maybe not the subsequent psychoanalysts. And it's such a loaded term in Marxist.
You mean production as such?
Discourse. I just wonder if that
what Carl referred to earlier, the totality of production, consumption, distribution, and exchange value, as Marx puts on in the introduction to the Grundrisse or the Critique of the Book.
Yeah, I don't have like a great point here. It's just something that I'm trying to think about, thinking about, because I think it's a word that that they're weaving through conceptually here. And I think it's, one of the key concepts I think starts to, bring together the Freudian stuff and the Marxist stuff.
Yeah, desiring production.
It's so loaded.
Okay, yeah. All right, yeah, if I can just...
and they're using it all these different ways,
Okay, yeah, okay, good. No, I mean, I'll go back to that and maybe try to show, this how they're trying to merge these two. Remember, this again is a very rich amalgamation as well. It's not only a work of, quote, it's certainly not our traditional logic at work here. And they point that out in terms of their syntheses, the connective, the conjunctive, the disjunctive, and the connective, right? Or the connective first and the conjunctive last, right? Yes, David, yes, please, yeah.
I was very struck by this very complex passage Carl quoted about the ego, the heritability, the sense of the superego rising almost in a fashion from the id. One of Freud's great shibboleths is the statement, the superego is the heir to the Oedipal complex. And so what I was thinking is, it's such an interesting passage because it almost seems like making these structures which Freud otherwise sees as really psychodynamic as kind of innate biological givens. They're inherited, they're in your blood, they're in your DNA, they're in your brain wiring. And it feels like it's Freud at his most concrete. In a way, having started out as a neurologist, he mostly doesn't stay there later on in his thinking. Michael, I'm curious for you in hearing that, does it feel like this is partly maybe one of the ways that these people are really anti-Oedipus is because they see this part of it as a kind of recession or regression in Freud's thought back to a biological substrate, and that is being an inducer potentially for them the path to kind of deconstructing Freud and finding a liberation against old hat psychoanalysis because it's a way of blowing that particular part of the family up. It's no longer in the name of the father, it's in the name of this very different fluid structure which wouldn't be something that just says you get the superego because you've had the Oedipal complex, but something else is happening with all of these structures.
Yeah, very well put. I think there is a revision, if you will. I mean, it's not just it's a radicalization, but really a revision of this familial, traditional familial complex. And in a way, it is an attack, if you will, on the Freudian biologism, with their own blend of biologism too, as you can see here too, with the notion of the body without organs. Right, in a sense, this is again, this question of desire is at the base here, right? It's desire, nature, and society that's working out as a triad, in many ways. And, and these are not, again, this is not Helmholtzian or, as you know, Freud's, relationships to neurology in the 19th century. But it is a kind of, in a way, an understanding of that, and that they didn't want to go that way, and really looking at what's happening on the ground with this politics of the family to rewrite that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. For them, again, Oedipus is trapped within the Western imperialism of a thought about, it's a very Western idea. to put it in politically correct terms. I don't buy that kind of thinking, but anyway, in a certain way, they are going against this kind of imperialism of Oedipus in the sense of how it played out in, quote, the bourgeois family, right? When they're noticing through the clinical studies, both at the clinic, the Guattari is practicing in, as well as Fanon's researches, as well as Lang's experiments. All these things are going on at this period. So they're really trying to go well beyond, yes, which you cite as Freud's, the great passages in Totem and Taboo, and what Carl read from Ego and the Id. The primal father, the killing of the primal father, there will never be rid of the father because of the guilt, the incest taboo, all of these things are at stake here, right? In a way, in some cultures, incest is okay. Yeah. This is another thing, right? I mean, for them, right? Yeah. Yeah. You know what I mean? I mean, this is something that they're looking at. How does this play out in the, quote, Western civilizations? They're looking at what are our laws, as Freud say, based on the incest taboo. This is Freud's, one of his insights in Totem and Taboo, that, the brothers kill the father, but the dead father turns out to be more powerful, right, than the living father, right, in a sense, and that the brotherhood develops better forms of domination as we go forward, right, in a sense. This is, as the primal story, if you will. And yeah, and what is the law based on? You shall not take your sister, right? The father is not supposed to take the daughter, right? All of these things are part of the moment, right? And this is what the law, and really in a way, the symbolic order is built on, right? Many ways. So in some ways, they're also attacking this in some ways, with all due respect to everybody here, maybe Klaus Kinski was around, the actor, who had, relations with his daughter. I mean, I'm just saying, this was, as we know, this was a very different period than the one we lived in too, in terms of, the opening up of, sexual repression and, the so-called sexual revolution. So, I mean, it's very complex, as you say. I mean, I love rereading. I'm glad Carl brought this to the table. I'm going to go find my copy and read Ego in the Id tonight. But this is wonderful stuff and all the revisions. But again, I want us to see that this is really an attempt, again, to get out of the trap of being, quote, the police adaptation of Oedipus again. Not that Freud was involved in that. Freud was a subversive. There's no question about it in my mind. Lacan was subversive. These were not state thinkers or people that, yeah. And I mean, Freud's remarks about, utopia, he was good friends with Romain Rolland, who came up with the famous phrase that Gramsci used, I believe in a pessimism of the intellect and an optimism of the will. He had long conversations with him about communism, about, utopic speculations, and just didn't think it would fit, in a way, so in that way, he's come to be, for one school of thought on the left, kind of capitalist realism, if you will, right, in some senses. So, I mean, but we should take this all into account without looking at, without just saying that we can apply traditional or Oedipal categories back to Deleuze and Guattari, or look at this way. And I think you've been very, very fair to them in terms of your reading of Freud, and Carl bringing in Ego and the Id to say, yeah, there's a different Freud at work here at times in terms of the revisions, but they have an antagonism here, obviously. Oedipus is an ideological form. They're looking at forms, they're looking at forms, how the forms play out in the socius. They're looking at this from a perspective that is much more Marxist than they're given credit for, right? I mean, yeah. I mean, it's no. I remember that Negre and Guattari wrote a text together in French. Literally, it translates "new spaces of liberty," but the American translation, because of L'Étranger, was "communists like us." So there was no question where these people came from. Yeah, yeah. Deleuze was called a red prince by the, in a derogatory way, by the nouveau philosophes. So there was a lot of antagonism about this book coming from the right, much less from the psychoanalytic community, that went on. And yeah, yeah. And
well, Michael, you also raised, I think, a really interesting point, and you would raise this, I think, in one of the first classes, is also like the kind of ideological intolerance that you see in so much of the left, the kind of authoritarianism,
right.
And I think it's very interesting that the moment we live in is sometimes those impulses are enacted through trying to sort of embrace or, critique oppression, critique domination. And, it's like a very, maybe it's our new double bind, so to speak. I don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
So interesting. Again, they're trying to get out. They have a very long time. We didn't go there tonight. Again, this is a book we could study for a long time, or at least do a lot of offshoots. And of course, anybody that's in doing graduate work right now or writing books, there's a lot of material here, a lot of ammunition to work with in terms of thought and thought patterns that could be put to use. Yeah, I mean, this is something that they saw too. One of the biggest antagonists were the Orthodox communists, the PCF, which was one of the worst. You know who one of the founders of the PCF was? Well, it was instrumental in French Marxism, was Paul Lafarge, Karl Marx's son-in-law. The one who wrote The Right to be Lazy. So this is interesting that they so far away from that, the French Communist Party, and this was another antagonist, and of course Althusser stayed in the party until his dying day, or close to it. I mean, until his madness day, if you will. And it's interesting that hold it had on some intellectuals, after the war, etc. So they have this in mind too. I mean, I'm trying to contextualize it, but I think it's broader than just the French scene, right? I mean, what they're up against, in some ways. Yeah, yeah. Joseph, I saw you had the thing off. Did you want to say something? Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I know it's getting late, as usual, we are interminable here. So we'll, I guess we can stop. What I'd like to do is, finish out this chapter. They have a very good section on the double bind. And I think, pages 106, maybe we can do next week, up to 106, very, very impressive work, up to 138, even though on the syllabus, the reading strategies, we should be in the book 3, Savages, Barbarian, and Civilized Men. We can go into that, but I thought maybe taking it slow here, maybe this section on Reich and the difference between social and psychic repression is very important, right? It is not psychoanalysis that invents Oedipus, is a nice, part of this as well. The undecidability of Oedipus, right? They put it into mathematical terms, Goethean terms in some ways. We can look at the paralogisms too of psychoanalysis, and as Bruno offered earlier, the temporality of the before, the after, the no beginning, and the afterwards, etc. So I think there's a lot there that we can do in 10, and maybe the 20 pages, and look at this too, to go back what Jeff raised about production as a loaded term here, and what they really mean by desiring production and why it's operative. And I want us to think, look, again, instead of thinking self, other, and society or something like that, like George Herbert Mead, or thinking this in terms of our usual categories, try to think a triad of desire, nature, and society. That could be, the working triad throughout this, that there's always this relation going on, desire, nature, and society in a way. Yeah. And
Michael, also,
yeah, please, Bruno,
also, like, when
at
the end,
I like the also. Yeah.
The also, yeah. No, they speak about, when they speak about literature in the last section, the process, and they say the process is more important than the goal. And a couple of pages earlier, they mentioned Zarathustra, right? And that's the same idea. That's a perfect figure that they themselves, in a very explicit way, they use, right? And say that's what Zarathustra is.
Right.
I mean, and Zarathustra also, right? I mean, the process, not the goal, is right. The crossing over, right?
The Uber.
Yeah.
The Uber. That's what it is in German. It's crossing over.
Right.
Uber. Right. I hate to say.
Exactly.
You know, capitalism's very slick and very good at picking up on.
Right. So we can talk about that next time as well.
Absolutely. And I think what we've really theorized or spoken to is the presence of Nietzsche throughout this, as not only an active figure at times, but really the hidden encounter here is more between Marx and Nietzsche than it is between Marx and Freud. I want to say that. Yeah, I mean, I'll put that out there with all due respect again to the, master psychoanalyst and great risk taker in a way. In some ways, this is an encounter, a historical encounter, if you will, between Nietzsche and Marx. Guattari is an ex-psychoanalyst, right, in some ways, deviating from the dangerous deviant of the Lacanian school. I'll phrase this in kind of characters, right? You have, Deleuze, the Nietzschean, right, in conversation with the Lacanian analyst, from, the clinic, the man of the streets, etc. And this is what the encounter really is, the everyday lifeness of Nietzsche and the psychopathology of everyday life, and and money as flow, right? Capital is flow too, in many ways.
And Michael, they say literally in the middle of page 131, these people of desire, these men of desire are like Zarathustra. That's what it is, right? So also because what Carl, what you were saying about the family made me think. I mean, that's an interesting question. But my sense is, I've been thinking about the family. Maybe the family is a body, and they speak about it. There is a great moment about the question of the body toward the end of this, right? When they quote, just a moment, sorry. What is it? I'm sorry. Gisela Pankov, the question of the limits of the body by touching. And I mean, so they speak about, again, what usually is understood as a pathology, but otherwise that's what it is. So there is in the relationships within the family or any community also this moment of the knowledge of one's body, affection, and so on and so forth. So I would say maybe they probably are not against that kind of situation of that is also part of what the family is. But certainly the family as an institution and as an agent of the reproduction of the same institutional forms, that seems to be under attack to me, right?
Yes,
I mean, that's I don't know if this
family
is
and the holy familialism is another ideological form under attack.
I would say so, because it is
and more sophisticated in some ways. It's a reading of Engels, but more sophisticated, and it is a kind of combination. I don't know if you've read Mother Right by the Swiss anthropologist Bachelfen, right, of which Engels takes his point of departure alongside Lewis Henry Morgan and the Iroquois Indians and how they live. But anyway, this is an interesting thing of Mutterrecht, of mother right. So they're looking also at societies that are built on the maternal, if you will, on the mother right and mother law. It's interesting too how far they take this. They're again, this is extremely well.
Because the family is ultimately a structure, a phenomenon of capture. Just like even the not only the nuclear family, the bourgeois, but even the broader family, the clan, or maybe more, like Calabria. I come from Calabria, Calabrian society, just to say, I mean, that's not necessarily a very nice situation to be in, from which very often there is no exit. You have to.
There's no exit. That's correct. There's no exit. I mean, Guard writes, his masterwork, which he considered his masterpiece, was on Gustave Flaubert, the family idiot. He spent 800 pages. I mean, he was a mad. That's all it was, he didn't edit. He just wrote and wrote. You talk about a writing machine. He went through 800 pages of the first volume of The Idiot of the Family, Gustave Flaubert, maybe part of the early modernist writing, according to Roland Barthes. He said, he's looking at this as the family constituted one of the great writers of the 19th century as an idiot. He was the idiot to the family.
Right. And Michael, no, since you speak of Sartre now and Flaubert, but even with Genet, I mean, he does say how his foster parents, right, ultimately, I mean, they said this child is a thief.
Right.
And so you become the thief that, I mean, the internalization and so on and so forth.
Absolutely.
I mean, yeah.
And so, this is a great, I don't think Alan Bass translated this one. It was a disaster to Gallimard, but Derrida's Glas is the risk, if you will, between the Hegelian system and capture and Genet as the orphan consciousness that is raised by public assistance and the ability to create new languages, et cetera. Genet wrote Thief's Journal, part of that on toilet paper in the prisons, right? These are, and Our Lady of the Flowers. So this is very interesting. They're also talking about orphan consciousness here. Yeah.
Yeah. The unconscious is an orphan. Yeah, they keep
the orphan also. So this is another way out that they're looking at. So there are a lot of different levels to this. I just want to read one passage. He says, from the little reading I had done, I had observed that the men who were the most in life, this is Henry Miller, they quoted, who were molding life, who were life itself, ate little, slept little, owned little, or nothing. They had no illusions about duty or the perpetuation of their kith and kin or the preservation of the state. The phantasmal world is the world which has never been fully conquered over, right? It is the world of the past, never of the future. To move forward clinging to the past is like dragging a ball and chain. This is Henry Miller speaking that they quote in the correction of, desire, right? In a way. What it is, right? In a sense. So there's no family involved here, right? In a sense, right? And think about Henry Miller. I mean, a person that's hates, born in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, left, couldn't stand America. He wrote a book called The Air-Conditioned Nightmare about the United States, which is not so far off, especially Houston, Texas, which is built on the concept of the air conditioner. But anyway, all to say, think about Miller, who goes to Paris with nothing in his pocket. He's a good, he's a high-class gigolo, educated gigolo, if you will, in some ways, with a good literary, form and hung around the right people. But this was an orphan consciousness. Genet. Where's the daddy, mommy, me there, right? In a sense. And how do you read this in a sense? They're looking to people like this. That's another thing. They're not reading. It's not Shakespeare here. I'm not knocking Shakespeare nor Christopher Marlowe for that matter. But they're reading Genet, Artaud, Céline, who was a doctor who, basically ended up being a collaborator, Nazi, at the Journey to the End of the Night, or more so, Death on the Installment Plan. And again, this whole notion of the debtor society. How do we live today? What do those things tell us? Yeah, please.
Just to quickly, that Henry Miller passage, there's another way of interpreting that, though, that is, it's an immature adolescent fantasy that envisions self-realization as outside of any connection, outside of any social obligation, and that in some sense I think it's very gendered, because somebody is left behind as the great self-realizing individual who has no obligation, no connection, no history. Somebody's left behind with the kids. And so I think that we need to be a little also,
fair enough. However, they're looking to the Rambos, they're looking to the Millers, they're looking to the people that come out of nowhere that create the state as well, et cetera. They're looking at a certain type too. I mean, that I want to be fair to them too in this way. I understand that about how that may be in a way, but also Spinoza lived this way, and there's nothing really adolescent about his philosophy, maybe about, and he lived a very, quote, scholarly life, this kind of thing. So Spinoza was this way too.
Yeah. It is, by the way, true that there is an interesting critique also of Henry Miller in Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex.
I'm just saying that they bring this in as a part of an example of the orphan consciousness, and where energy is not blocked. That's where I think they're really trying to go. For them, in a way, if you re-territorialize, you re-Oedipalize, you're always in this position where the energy can be then blocked, stymied, where a conundrum exists. Yeah, no, I agree with you. I'm not the biggest fan of Henry Miller either. In a sense. But on another level, I did hear the stories when people went to visit him in Big Sur, they were expecting to go to, a big sescapade or orgies, and all they would do is get a meal and then he would send them home when he was, anyway. So, yeah. So anyway, and Miller
Michael, do we know, is there another English translation of this text?
Another English translation?
A different one?
Not that I know of. Why? I mean, why do you ask?
I asked Josh to send me a French version, and it's really strikingly different in tone. And there's a lot more poetry and rhyming, and there's a lot more going on.
Yes, I agree.
Rhythm, and also conceptually, these translators added a lot of crap.
Okay.
So, I mean, they really over-interpreted some basic concepts, I think.
Okay.
So I'm just curious.
Well, I mean, Richard can speak to that. He knows one of the translators. Maybe he could say something.
Who's that?
Yeah. He knows.
Oh,
Richard.
Yeah.
Hi. Mark Seam is acupuncturist today up on the Upper West Side.
So we have personal, And by the way, Bob Hurley got into it with Foucault. So that's another translator here too. I don't know about Helen Lane. She actually did a very good translation of Gostiolo's The Juan the Landless. She was very good with Spanish. Maybe they're just not good with the French.
No, it seems like a heavy interpretation. Just looking at the first page.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, well, maybe we'll turn it into. We'll bring. I wish I had my. I'm on a border police won't let me in to get my books.
Well, Josh has it right here. Where's Josh? Is he still here?
Josh has it in French. Okay.
He sent it to me. I'll see if I can repost it.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah. I mean, I know the wordplay is there. They're very, very playful individuals.
It's more than that. It's that the machine. The construction of the idea of the desiring machine. Oh,
okay, right.
I didn't do it right. I have trouble sometimes cutting and pasting in Zoom.
Okay, no problem. We'll get it from Josh next week. Rocky, you wanted to say something? I see.
Yes. Just to go back to orphans, a great symbolic orphan is Mario Savio.
Yes, Mario Savio.
He comes from nowhere.
Yeah, he comes from nowhere. That's right. He was a great orator. He came from Brooklyn, but from
and then he was educated by the Jesuits. But at the moment that he hit the scene,
right,
he was an orphan.
Yeah, that's true. It's true.
A symbolic orphan.
Yeah. Have you guys ever listened to Mario Savio speak? I mean, maybe some of you. You should go to YouTube to see if you can get some of Savio's speak. Amazing in terms of the student movements of that period. I mean, Tom had, nothing compared to this character. I mean, or any of the other, white boy, really even the Panthers, any of them. Savio really had it, in terms of the ability to, sway a crowd, etc. One of the giants out there. Yeah.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you, Lydia. Thank you, everybody.
Maybe I go
we'll
to,
pick it up
okay.
next week. And,
all right.
Yeah,
Good
look
night.
forward to it. And thank you for all the great thoughts. And sorry to keep everybody so late. It's a tendency, but maybe not a bad one sometimes.
That's good.
Okay, good night.
See you.
I hope
Good
to
night,
see you
everybody.
soon, Eloy. I'm looking forward. Yeah,
I'm looking forward too.
Yeah, me
Yes.
too. Very much. We're gonna have a great dinner at my place.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, great. See you then. Thank
Okay.
you.
Good. Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.